Welcome, dear listener. You found a quiet place, far from the noise of the modern world. Tonight, we're going back in time to a place of snow-covered cabins, flickering firelight and the silent strength of those who once lived on the edge of the American frontier. This is a slow, gentle story. There's no rush here, no twists or cliffhangers, just a slow unfolding of a winter's tale, told softly and without urgency. As you listen, you'll follow the quiet rhythm of life during one long, harsh winter in the 1800s. You'll hear how a pioneer family endured the cold, found comfort in small rituals, and discovered meaning in stillness. There will be snowstorms and silence, the warmth of a wood stove, the hush of a world buried in white. But most of all, there will be calm. So let your shoulders relax, let your breath slow, and as the wind begins to whistle through the trees and the fire crackles low, feel free to drift off whenever your mind is ready. There's no need to stay awake. This story is here to keep you company, even as you sleep. The wind did not howl at first, nor did it shriek down from the distant mountains with the fury of a blizzard or the menace of storm. It simply arrived quietly, almost respectfully, drifting to the tall, brittle grasses of the prairie as though it had been expected, as though it had been coming all along, and no one had thought to stop it. There was something soft in the way it touched the wooden frames of the homesteads, a gentle knocking here and there, like a polite visitor rapping at the door before the hour grew late. It stirred the ash and fire pit and lifted the edges of old rugs by the hearth, not yet cold enough to bring fear, but enough to bring pause, a nudge to the bones and a whisper through the chinks in the walls that another season had quietly turned the page. The sky was not the deep, endless blue of high summer anymore, nor the golden haze of early fall with its scent of dry leaves and harvest smoke. It had flattened now, as though pressed down by the hand of something vast and still, turning a pale, indifferent gray that seemed to stretch from one edge of the world to the other. It did not move much, that sky, but simply hover above the world like a heavy sheet hung too low, muffling sound, dulling color, making everything look older and more tired than it had just a week before. There was a silence, too, not the pleasant quiet of a lazy afternoon, but the thick, breath-holding hush that comes when a land is waiting for something it knows is inevitable. Along the edge of the tree-line, the animals had already begun to disappear, one by one. Birds that once filled the morning with chatter had grown scarce, their silhouettes vanishing southward with barely a farewell. The squirrels, once so busy darting between branches and stashing their treasures beneath roots and stones, had now gone still, leaving only faint scratches in the frost-dusted earth and the memory of movement. Even the deer seemed more ghost-like now, thin and alert, watching from the shadows without daring to step into the open unless necessity demanded it. The air had changed them, too, not just in temperature, but in tone, a deeper rhythm that the wild ones felt long before the settlers did. Inside one of the weathered log cabins scattered across the open land, a man sat by the window, his breath forming faint clouds on the glass that slowly faded, only to reappear again and again with the rhythm of his lungs. He was not old by most reckonings, but he had lived long enough out here to feel the truth in his bones, feel the dampness rising from the ground, the brittle edge in the air, the way the world seemed to pull inward just before winter arrived in full. His boots were beside the fire, drying from the morning's chores, and his hands, cracked and stained, rested motionless on his knees. He was listening, not to the wind exactly, but to the hush that it brought, as though waiting for the land to speak again. Behind him, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and wool, of dried herbs and something faintly sour from the root cellar. The boards creaked gently beneath the shifting weight of someone above, his wife, perhaps, or one of the children gathering another quilt from the loft. There were no clocks ticking, no sound of traffic or wires humming. Only the slow tick of a single drip from the eaves and the occasional pop of resin in the stove. It was a life suspended, not in motion but in preparation, like a long breath drawn in and held tight, unsure when to be released. In the small yard outside, a thin crust of frost had formed overnight, not thick enough to linger past mid-morning, but just firm enough to crunch beneath a boot sole. The grass, once tall and unruly, had bowed down beneath the cold, and the garden rows were empty now, marked only by the ghostly outlines of where corn once stood and where beans had once climbed. The pumpkins were long picked and cured, the last onions braided and hung, and only the withered stalks remained, stiff with cold, waiting to be plowed on to come spring, if spring ever came at all. In the barn, the animals stirred less now, their movements slow and cautious, as though they too understood that wasting energy was no longer something they could afford. The cow had grown quiet, her grate, dark eyes blinking slowly as her breath formed white clouds in the chill morning air. Chickens nestled deep in their straw, feathers puffed up, and the mule stood motionless in the shadows, steam rising from its nostrils in slow, rhythmic bursts. There was a resignation in their stillness, as if they had accepted the season's terms without complaint, knowing they had no vote in the matter. The children had noticed it too, not in the ways adults did, not with words or worries or the careful calculation of food stores, but in the way they hesitated before stepping outside, and how they no longer ran barefoot across the yard or lingered on the porch long after supper. Their games grew quieter, close to the hearth, and their laughter, once wild and high-pitched, now seemed to roll softly like distant thunder beneath a blanket. They asked fewer questions about the coming weeks, sensing that even their parents did not know the answers. No snow had fallen yet, not truly. A few flurries had danced through the air days earlier, melting on contact and disappearing like dreams upon waking, but nothing had stayed. Still, there was something in the air, something in the slowness of clouds and the deepening silence between sounds, that made it clear. It would not be long now. The land was not just getting colder, it was bracing, hunkering down, preparing itself for a season that offered no bargains and kept no promises. The man by the window let out a slow breath and finally stood, stretching his stiff legs and walking to the stove, where he opened the door and fed in another piece of wood with practiced care. The flames took it eagerly, snapping softly, and the heat rolled out like a sigh across the room. He glanced at the shelves above the hearth, rows of jars, each holding something harvested months ago, a memory sealed in glass, and then turned to the door. There were chores still to be done, even now, even as the world stilled. He pulled on his coat, lined with patches and faint smells of smoke and hide, then reached for his gloves. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, not harsh, not violent, just steady, just present, like a hand on the shoulder reminding him that time was moving forward whether he was ready or not. And as he stepped out into the brittle air, boots crunching on the frosted porch, he saw the first true breath of winter trailing from his lips, curling like ghost smoke in the morning light, and he knew deep in his chest that whatever warmth had been carried from the season before was now little more than a memory fading into the cold. It was not panic that stirred him into motion, nor a frantic scrambling to beat the cold, but rather something older, something baked into the bones of those who had chosen to live where the land gave no guarantees and the sky often withheld its kindness. They did not speak much of the cold that was coming, nor the long stretch of weeks that would pass in darkness and stillness, but their actions became their language, and those actions were deliberate, quiet, and methodical. There was no need to announce what needed doing. Each person in the homestead, from the smallest child to the oldest grandmother, knew that when the air held its breath and the sun began to shrink away a little more each day, the time for talk had passed, and the time for preparing had begun. In the small, slanted barn behind the cabin, the man spent his morning checking the roof for leaks, testing the beams for any sign of rot, brushing his gloved hands over old nails that might work loose when the deep freeze set in. He said nothing as he worked, but his face was set with the expression of someone measuring time not by hours or days, but by how many logs it would take to reach March. The axe at his side had a handle worn smooth by seasons past, and when he split the firewood, the sound of blade against log echoed into the pale distance like a heartbeat, strong and repetitive. Behind the barn, a long stack of already cut was stood like a crooked wall against the elements, its outer layer dusted white by last night's frost, its inner pieces slowly drying with the hope of burning clean. Closer to the cabin, the children were gathering dried corn stalks left from the harvest, pulling them into bundles with mittened hands and tying them tight with old twine. The stalks would not last long in the stove, but they were good for kindling, for sparking warmth into the larger logs when morning made the hearth cold again. The children giggled only occasionally, and even that was brief, the sound muffled beneath woolen scarves in the thick hush of the land. Each step they took crunched faintly in the dry grass, each movement stirring up a little puff of breath or a swirl of fine dust. They looked at the house often, checking the smoke from the chimney, as though it were a signal from the hearth that all was still well within. Inside the cabin, His wife was working at the table with quiet purpose. Her sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the chill. Her hands red from the cold water used to scrub the root vegetables clean. She was inspecting each potato, turning in the light of the window, setting aside the ones that had gone soft or sprouted too far, and placing the rest gently into a basket lined with burlap. Beside her, rows of jars lined the shelf. Peaches and syrup, beans and brine, tomatoes suspended in their own rich color, and she ran her fingers lightly over the lids to check the seals, listening for the faintest hiss that might betray a broken vacuum. There were no labels, no need for names or dates. She remembered each one by heart. Remembered the hours in July when she stood over the steaming stove with the windows flung open, trying to trap the summer in glass. By the hearth, the grandmother was patching a quilt, her needle moving with the slow confidence of someone who had threaded hundreds of such stitches before. The fabric was worn thin in places, but she turned each patch carefully in her lap, matching color not for beauty, but for function, knowing that every square of cloth was one more layer between a body and the night's cold. She hummed softly as she worked, not a melody with structure or name, but the kind of hum that came from memory, from stories long tucked away in the folds of time. Her eyes, though cloudy with age, missed no detail, and her ears caught even the soft clatter of boots outside when a man came back from the barn with another load wood balanced over his shoulder. As the hours passed, the cabin became a small universe of motion, each member of the family moving through their appointed tasks like stars in orbit, never colliding, never straying far. The younger boy cleaned out the stove ash, dumping the fine gray powder into a tin pail and carrying it outside to be scattered along the icy path. The older girl boiled water and poured it into stone jars, wrapping them in rags and tucking them beneath the bedding to hold some warmth through the night. The father repaired the door latch with twine and a nail, his breath clouding before him in little bursts of concentration. No one asked what came next. No one needed to. Beneath the floorboards, the root cellar held what remained of their provisions: basket of onions, rows of carrots packed in sand, jars of pickled beets and cabbage, and small cloth sacks filled with cornmeal and flour. It was cold down there, but not freezing, and the dampness clung to every surface like a second skin. The cellar smelled of earth and time, of everything they had managed to wrestle from the land before the frost crept in. When the trapdoor was lifted, the cold spilled upward like a fog, mixing with the warmth of the kitchen, reminding them of how thin the barrier was between safety and scarcity. And beyond the homestead, the forests and hills lay still, silent beneath the dim sun. No birds called now, no insects buzzed. Only the wind moved, tugging softly at the edges of the world like a hand trying gently to remove a blanket. In the distance, smoke curled from a neighboring chimney, a thin gray line rising into the flat sky and fading before it could reach any real height. There was comfort in knowing others still stood out there, families in cabins of their own, performing the same tasks, following the same rhythms, locked in the same quiet agreement with the land. Winter was not a battle to be won, but a presence to be endured, and they endured it not alone but in parallel. As the light faded, the sky deepened from gray to steel blue, then to something closer to slate, and finally to a soft black strewn with stars so faint they seemed imagined. The family gathered around the fire, not for conversation. There was little new to say, but simply to sit in its glow, to let the heat soak into their limbs and the flicker of the flames remind them of movement, of change, of the passage of hours. Outside, frost was forming again on the edges of the windows, drawing patterns that curled like vines and spread like veins, delicate and inevitable. And when the firewood was stacked for night, the stove closed tight, the quilts drawn up around chins and shoulders, and the final lantern turned low, the cabin exhaled, as though the house itself could finally rest from a day spent in preparation. Somewhere far off, a single coyote howled, thin, high, and distant, but its voice faded quickly into the stillness, swallowed by the rising cold. In the hush that followed, beneath layers of wool and silence, sleep crept in like the frost, unnoticed until it was everywhere, until it softened every sound and stilled every hand. And by the time the moon reached its highest point in the sky, the family had already surrendered to the rhythm of the season, nestled in their preparations, held safe for now against the long breath of winter waiting just outside their door. By the time the third week of cold had pressed itself fully upon the land, the sense of distance had begun to grow, not just in miles or in minutes, but in something heavier, something quieter, an absence more than a presence, as though the world itself had drawn inward, pulling the corners of its great blanket tight and whispering to its inhabitants to do the same. The path that once led into the woods, once so well-trodden and familiar, was now just a faint indentation beneath a shallow drift of snow, a memory of footsteps slowly fading into the whiteness. The wagon ruts that curved toward the settlement, once dry and hard and lined with grass, had disappeared beneath the weight of several nights' frost and a handful of quiet snowfalls, until even the direction of travel seemed uncertain. Nothing had been erased loudly or suddenly. No storm had roared through a fury, but little by little, day by day, the outside world had closed its doors, leaving each family behind them to tend their own fires and keep their own company. Inside the cabin, the passage of time grew more difficult to measure. The days, though technically shorter, felt longer, stretched out by the sameness of their routines and the stillness of the landscape outside. The sun would rise, pale and unconvincing, casting a light that held no warmth and barely any color, before retreating again behind a veil of clouds or slipping away into an early dusk that arrived without fanfare. There were clocks in some homes, perhaps a family heirloom or a prize purchased long ago in a distant town, but most people did not rely on them. They knew time instead by the habits of the animals, the creak of the beams as the house adjusted to the cold, and the groaning in their own bones when the temperature dropped again during the early hours of the morning. Letters would not arrive in weeks like these. The nearest post road lay miles away, and even that was nothing more than a dirt track winding through low valleys and patches of frozen brush. Once the snows came, the mail stopped, not by decree, but simply because the horses would not travel, the wheels would not turn, and the men hired to deliver such things would not risk their lives for a handful of sealed papers when their own families waited at home with cold fingers and empty hearts. Those who waited for news learned instead to imagine it, to picture loved ones in distant cities, seated near their own fires, wrapped in their own blankets, thinking of the same silence and wondering, perhaps, if word would ever make its way west again. Visitors, too, had vanished, not deliberately, not unkindly, but simply because the journey was no longer feasible. The neighbors who once stopped by with a basket of late apples or a spool of thread or a bit of gossip now remained cloistered in their own cabins, tending their own fires, watching their own smoke curl into the gray sky. And though nothing had been said aloud, though no agreement had been made between households, each family knew to stay put, to conserve their strength and their fuel and their warmth, for there would be many weeks still ahead when none of those things could be taken for granted. It was not loneliness, not exactly, but a kind of still communion across the distance, a mutual withdrawal from the world with quiet understanding that life, for a time, must shrink to the size of one's own roof. Inside, that shrinking was both comfort and weight. The rooms that had once felt spacious in summer, when the doors and windows stood open and the breeze carried voices from one end of the yard to the other, now felt smaller with each passing day. The walls, made of logs and sealed with mud and straw, kept the worst of the cold at bay, but did little to expand the mind. The ceiling hung lower, the floorboards felt nearer, and every creak, every cough, every whispered word bounced off the walls and returned again, familiar and inescapable. The children adapted in their own quiet way. At first, they had filled the corners of the cabin with drawings scratched into birch bark, with clumsy wheeled animals and dolls made from corn husks and scrap fabric, with songs hummed under their breath as they swept the floor or fed the fire. But as the days grew colder and the nights longer, their play turned slower, less imaginative, more mechanical. They took to sitting near the stove, their bodies curled beneath patchwork quilts, their eyes half closed as they listened to the ticking of the kettle and the rustling of the fire. They didn't complain. Children on the frontier rarely did. But the restlessness had settled into their limbs like snow on the ground, silent, soft, and heavy. Sometimes, the man would open the door and step out onto the porch, not to do any task in particular, but just to see what had changed. He would scan the tree line, now etched in white, and listen for any noise beyond the wind. An animal, a falling branch, anything at all. But most of the time, there was nothing. The wind would blow in one direction, then another, and the only sound would be his own boots creaking faintly against the dry, frozen wood. He would wait a moment longer, squinting into the white horizon as though expecting someone to appear, a traveler, a friend, a sign, but no one ever came. And eventually, with a slow breath and a final glance, he would step back inside and latch the door once more. They had each other, of course. That was no small thing. The family spoke in low voices, often about little matters. The taste of the last batch of bread, the need to mend a bootlace, the story of the neighbor from a year ago who trapped a bear before the snow fell. These conversations were not profound, but they filled the air, warmed the cabin just a little more than the fire alone could manage. And in that warmth, in those softly spoken words, they found rhythm to carry them through the silence outside. Yet still, there was something in that silence that grew. Not fear, not yet, but a kind of weight, a presence just beyond the window, waiting. Each night, the wind would rise a little more, as though testing the seams of the house, looking for weakness. Each morning, the frost on the panes grew thicker, more intricate, as if the cold were carving messages into the glass, messages no one could quite read. And the snow, though still light, began to linger now, refusing to melt even when the sun rose for its brief visit each day. The world was becoming still, and in that stillness, there was a strange beauty, an order, a clarity, a soft, relentless quiet that dulled the mind and slowed the breath. But there was also the knowledge that they were alone now, each family in their own cabin, their own world, their own winter, and that until the thaw came, or until the land saw fit to stir again, there would be no footsteps at the door, no riders on the trail, no voices beyond those within these four wooden walls. And so the man sat again by the window that night, his breath fogging the glass in gentle waves, and watched the snow begin to fall. Not a storm, not yet, but steady, sure, and without end. Each flake was a promise, and the promises were piling high. There was a kind of religion to it, though no hymns were sung, no incense burned, and no scripture was ever recited beyond the soft crackling of the hearth and the deep, rhythmic thud of blade into wood. Each morning began not with words or prayers, but with the lighting of the fire, and in that quiet act, the gathering of coals, the careful placement of kindling, the slow coaxing of flame into warmth, there was reverence enough for any creed. The man rose before the others, as he always had, stepping quietly into the early dark, his breath already visible as he moved toward the stove, his body still stiff from the sleep that never seemed deep enough in the cold months. He did not need a candle. He could move through the cabin by memory alone, his hand finding the latch, the poker, the basket of wood. Everything was in its place, because in winter, nothing could afford to be out of place. The fire had not gone out, not entirely. There was a glow still in the coals, a faint pulse of heat buried beneath the gray ash, and it was enough. With practiced fingers, he brushed aside the ash just enough to expose the embers, then laid the thinnest twigs atop them, arranged like a fragile house of sticks, open enough to breathe but close enough to catch. He blew on them slowly, evenly, and after a few moments, the first thread of smoke curled upward, thin and blue, followed by a soft orange flicker. The kindling snapped faintly, then hissed as it caught, and soon the flame grew bold, licking at the edges of the first split log like a starving animal finally fed. Only then did he lean back, rubbing his hands together once and placing them near the rising warmth. Not too close, not yet, but just enough to feel it begin. Outside, the world remained frozen, but within these walls, life was measured in fire. Not time, not weather, not even food, but heat. If the fire lived, they lived. It was that simple. And so the days became a series of returns to the stove, of tending and feeding, of judging the temperature not by thermometer, but by feel, how quickly breath turned to mist indoors, how the floor felt beneath bare feet, how long it took the butter to soften near the windowsill. These were the tools by which they measured survival. And above all, there was the wood. The pile behind the house had grown smaller, not dangerously so, not yet, but noticeably. The man had built a high in the autumn, taller than his shoulder, stacked with care so that air could flow and snow could not cling. Each piece had been split by hand. Oak, mostly, with some maple and hickory, cut down in the summer and left to dry, seasoned enough now to burn hot and clean. Still, it vanished more quickly than one might think. A log every hour, sometimes more if the wind blew hard or the sky stayed gray. A stove might eat its own weight in a day, and so the man chopped more. He brought the axe out mid-morning, after the animals had been checked and the stove refilled. It was a simple tool, heavy and blunt at the back, sharp at the front, with a handle that bore the marks of years. His gloves, stiff with frost, gripped it as he carried it toward the chopping stump at the edge of the yard. The snow crunched beneath his boots in a way that only true cold could make happen, dry, tight, almost hollow, and the sky above was a white sheet, unbroken and silent. He said nothing as he worked. The axe rose and fell in steady arcs, each strike sending a dull thud into the still air, each log splitting with a satisfying crack that echoed faintly against the woods beyond. Sometimes he imagined someone else hearing that sound, a neighbor, perhaps, in their own yard, pausing for a moment to listen and nod to themselves, knowing that someone else, too, was out there working, surviving, enduring. But he never saw them, not in this season. Only the sound moved freely now. The children helped in their own way. The older boy gathered the split wood and stacked it near the porch, glancing often toward the house to see if his breath still lingered in the air as he exhaled. The girl brought armfuls to the indoor basket, her arms trembling under the weight, but she never dropped a piece. Even the youngest tried to be useful, gathering bark and twigs, dragging a wooden sled behind him with a seriousness that seemed far older than his years. No one was idle. There was no room for idleness. Not now. To be still for too long was to grow cold, and to grow cold was to fall behind. Inside, the stove spoke its own language. It popped and hissed, groaned and whispered, and those sounds became part of the home's voice, part of the way the family understood their world. When the wood hissed too long, it meant it had not dried properly. When it burned too fast, it meant the air was too dry or the stove too hot. When the metal sides grew orange with heat, it meant caution, not comfort. And when the stove grew quiet, when its voice dimmed to a low murmur, it meant someone had waited too long to tend it, and the balance was shifting. There were no luxuries here. No central hearth with dancing flames and cushioned chairs. Just a stove, iron blackened, old, standing in the center of the home like an altar, fed with care and respected without sentiment. Around it, boots dried, socks steamed, food warmed, and bodies gathered. It was not beautiful, but it was vital. Sometimes late at night, the man would wake from a light sleep and rise without thinking, moving to the stove to check it, not because he had heard anything, not because the cold had reached him, but because something in his body knew it was time. He would lift the iron lid, peer inside, and judge, always judge, whether the coals had enough life left in them, whether another log was needed, whether the cabin could make it until morning. Often, he would add one more piece, just to be safe, and sit beside it until crackling grew steady again, until the warmth crept outward and the shadows on the wall danced in that slow, sleepy way that signaled peace. And then he would return to his bed, not because it was comfortable, it never truly was in winter, but because it was enough. His hands, still smelling faintly of smoke and bark, would fold beneath the quilt, and he would listen as the house breathed around him. The creak of wood, the sigh of wool, the faint rustle of a child turning in sleep. The fire was alive, and that meant they were, too. Outside, the wind rose again, just slightly, just enough to rattle the edge of the shutter and moan against the eaves, and the snow continued to fall, soft, slow, steady, like time itself, covering the world in silence. Though the fire kept them warm and the stove offered a hearth for gathering, it was the food they had stored that would carry them through the long season ahead. And as the snow deepened and the wind grew sharper, the shelves and cellars of the homestead began to take on a deeper significance, becoming more than simple storage, becoming instead a quiet archive of past labors and hard-earned security. Each jar, each sack, each small wax seal crock had a history behind it. A day or week in a year just gone by when the sun had been high and the fields generous, when hands had worked in warmth and the harvest had filled the baskets faster than they could be emptied. But now, in winter, those same stores were no longer memories of abundance, but the currency of survival, counted and recounted, portioned with care, and guarded with a reverence that bordered on sacred. The root cellar, dug deep beneath the house before the first frost ever touched the ground, was the heart of their food reserve. The trapdoor in the floor creaked as it was lifted, the iron ring cold beneath the hand, and the chill that rose from below was different than the cold outside. Not biting, not aggressive, but a damp, earthen coolness that clung to skin and carried the smell of earth, stone, and aging vegetables. A lantern was often needed, though even in its flickering light, one could make out the shapes lining the shelves. Baskets of potatoes, their skins dimpled and dusty, onions braided in long, tangled strands, jars of pickled beets stacked 2 rows deep, carrots buried in boxes of sand to keep them crisp, and crocks of sauerkraut sealed with thick layers of wax and cloth, waiting patiently to be opened. Nothing was wasted, nothing forgotten. Each item in that cellar had been chosen, cleaned, packed, and stored with the understanding that it might need to last not just through December and January, but perhaps through March and even April, should the spring decide to delay its return. And so, meals were planned with quiet calculation, not with the haste of hunger or the desire for pleasure, but with the measured thoughtfulness of a family who knew that every bite taken now was a bite not available later. Above, in the kitchen, the mother worked without extravagance. A pot of beans might simmer for most of the day, flavored with a piece of salt pork saved just for such a time, its aroma filling the cabin not with decadence, but with the comfort of something warm and nourishing. Cornbread, made from a dwindling supply of meals stored in a tight-lidded tin, was baked in a cast-iron skillet and served with just a touch of lard, spread thin. Sometimes, when the day had been especially cold, she would open one of the precious jars of fruit, peaches or blackberries suspended in syrup made months ago, and serve them in wooden bowls, small portions, just enough for a taste of color and sweetness in the pale hush of winter. Each meal was simple, but not joyless. The children ate slowly, their spoons clinking softly against the sides of their bowls, their eyes closing now and then at the warmth of each mouthful. The father ate with quiet appreciation, his face lined with thought as he looked not only at the food before him, but at what remained, already planning ahead, already measuring what tomorrow's meal might look like. There were no second helpings. Not now, but no one complained. On the frontier, appetite was not the same as entitlement. It was a fact of life, something to be acknowledged but not indulged. Preserves played a special role, their colors like stained glass lined up along the shelf beside the hearth. Even in winter, they glowed with the light of summer, the red of raspberry, the golden hue of pear, the deep plum of elderberry jam. But these were not open on a whim. They were reserved, brought out only when someone was ill or when a celebration was needed. A birthday, perhaps, or the first snowfall, or the return of the trapper from the far woods. And when one was opened, the act was ceremonial. The lid cracked slowly, the aroma released like a ghost of July, filling the room with warmth not of temperature, but of memory. Grain was rationed more carefully than anything. The sacks of flour were kept in the pantry, raised off the floor to avoid dampness, inspected often for any signs of spoilage or infestation. It was sifted before use, not just for cleanliness, but out of habit, a small ritual that gave a sense of control. And with it came the endless decisions. Should it be used for bread, or stretched further into dumplings? Could it be thickened into a porridge, or should it be saved for next week's baking? Each decision was quiet, small, and yet weighted, for the sack did not refill itself, and there were no stores to restock it until thaw. Sometimes, when the meals had been particularly lean, the family would speak of dishes from other seasons, not to lament, not to stir hunger, but to remind themselves of continuity. They spoke of corn roasted in its husk over an open fire, of apple pies cooling on windowsills, of stews thick with vegetables straight from the garden, and of butter churned fresh and spread over soft bread. These stories were spoken not with yearning but with patience, like a long lullaby told in reverse, a gentle reminder that the present cold was not eternal, that somewhere beneath the snow, the soil still remembered how to give. Salt was a treasure, stored in a small crock and used the precision of gold dust. The pork had been cured months ago, hung in the smokehouse, and checked regularly for mold. Each piece cut from it was scraped and rinsed, then boiled slowly to soften its toughness. Fat rendered from it was collected and saved in jars, used not only for cooking, but also for lamps and greasing tools. Even the bones had value, boiled for broth, cracked for marrow, dried and saved for future use. Nothing could be wasted. Waste was a luxury they could not afford. And yet, despite the austerity, There was a sense of quiet pride in how the food was managed. The cabin might not be full of bounty, but it was not empty either. The family had worked hard for every grain, every root, every jar, and that effort lived in the meals they shared. Even in silence, around a small table lit only by lantern light, there was a kind of communion, not in words or rituals, but in the shared knowledge that each mouthful had been earned, each spoonful a small victory over the cold. After the dishes were cleaned, scrubbed with hot water heated on the stove, dried with linen towel gone thin from years of use, the pantry was closed again, the cellar hatch sealed, the lamp trimmed, and the family returned to their evening tasks. Knitting, mending, reading, sitting. The fire was fed once more, the coals banked, and the warmth carefully kept. Outside, the snow had fallen again, layering the earth in quiet forgetfulness, as though the world itself had agreed to rest. But inside, beneath quilts and above earthen floors, the food they had stored held its ground, waiting patiently for tomorrow and the day after that, and however many more days winter chose to give. With the world outside buried beneath silence and snow, and the roads long since surrendered to ice and drifts too deep to walk with ease, the rhythm of life within the cabin began to take on a certain measured stillness, a kind of soft, deliberate repetition that governed each hour and each movement with the quiet dignity of those who understood that survival was not won through drama or bursts of energy, but through constancy, patience, and care. Each day, though technically its own, bled into the next with such similarity that the passing of time became less a series of dates and more a cycle of sounds and sights and sensations that slowly folded one upon the other, like the layering of snow upon the eaves, soft and steady and unending. Morning began before the sun made its reluctant appearance, for the sun, during these winter weeks, seemed to struggle to climb above the horizon at all, and when it did, it offered only a pale, watery light that lacked both warmth and color. Instead, it was the soft stirring of the man rising from his bed, the quiet creak of the floorboard beneath his weight, the rustle of quilts and the faint clink of the stove's iron door that signaled the beginning of a new day. His movements were slow and methodical, not sluggish, not reluctant, but careful, as if each gesture had been practiced 100 times before. He moved by feel and familiarity, not needing to think about the location of the wood basket or the shape of the fire poker in his hand. He did not speak, for there was no need. The house, still heavy with sleep, responded with sighs and groans, the wooden walls settling against the frost, the beams whispering under the burden of their own weight. Once the fire had been stirred and fed, its warmth gradually returned to the cabin, moving from corner to corner like the tide, slow and persistent. The mother would wake soon after, tie her shawl tight across her shoulders, rubbing her hands to drive away the chill. She moved to the hearth without speaking, lifting the kettle and refilling it from the crock of water kept inside to keep it from freezing. The water moved thickly, sluggish and cold, but would boil eventually, and the day would begin. Coffee, weak but warm, was brewed if the beans still held out. Otherwise, there was tea brewed from dried mint or pine needles, or simply hot water with a spoonful of molasses to give the illusion of richness. The children rose with more hesitation, not from laziness or rebellion. There was little room for such things in a home where every hand mattered, but from the sheer difficulty of leaving the warmth of their beds. Their breath puffed white in the cold air, and their bodies remained wrapped in quilts as long as possible. But eventually, they dressed in layers, often without removing their sleep clothes, simply adding sweaters and coats on top. They sat close to the stove to eat, their cheeks pink from the chill, their hands cradling metal cups of hot broth or porridge, slowly spooned with solemn patience. No one asked what the day would bring, for it would be the same as the day before, and likely the same as the one after. Chores began almost as soon as breakfast ended, not from urgency, but because there was simply no other way. The stove needed tending. The animals, few as they were, needed feeding and checking. The barn door had to be unlatched, its hinges pried open with effort after another night of freezing. The cow's water trough was often frozen over and needed to be broken open with the back of an axe or the point of a shovel. The chickens, if they had not frozen during the night, clucked lowly and huddled together, their feathers puffed in defiance of the cold. The mule stood patiently, unmoving except for the slow blink of its eyes and the vapor of its breath curling into the cold air. Inside, the mother and older children swept the floor, beat the dust from the woolen clothes, stitched and mended the garments worn thin by constant use. The grandmother sat near the window with her knitting, the needles clicking softly like insect wings, her face unreadable but peaceful, a silent fixture of warmth and presence. The younger children recited their letters or practiced their numbers with chalk on scraps of slate, their fingers smudged, their minds wandering but anchored by the presence of their family around them. There were no teachers, no desks, no school bells, just a gentle insistence on a mother who knew that the mind, too, needed feeding through winter. Meals were quiet, predictable, simple. A midday stew, a loaf of bread of flour allowed, maybe a spoonful of jam, or a small slice of cheese carefully rationed. There was no abundance, but always enough. And the warmth of the food, even if thin or repetitive, brought comfort not just to the body, but to the soul, around the table. Few words were spoken, but there was a deep companionship in the silence, the sort of bond that forms when each person knows the weight the other carries, and no one seeks to make theirs heavier. As the sun began its slow, downward arc, though it had barely risen above the trees, it cast long blue shadows across the snow, and the family began to draw back inward, pulling their tasks closer to the fire, preparing again for the darkness. Lamps were lit early, their dim glow casting golden halos on the cabin walls. The woodpile inside was restocked, the blankets aired and refolded, and any remaining chores were finished before the night grew too deep. Outside, the snow might continue to fall, or it might not, but it hardly mattered. The world beyond the cabin's walls had become still, distant, unreachable. Everything that needed doing was already within. Evening brought stories, if there was strength left to tell them. The grandmother might recall a winter even colder than this one, when wolves had come within sight of the barn, and the creek had frozen so solid they could walk across it. Or perhaps the father would murmur a tale of his own boyhood, when he had ridden through snow to fetch medicine for his brother. The children listened with heavy eyes, their limbs limp beneath heavy quilts, their minds adrift in the blurred boundary between story and dream. And as sleep crept in quietly, like snow drifting against a door, the cabin grew still once more. The fire, banked and secure, glowed low in the stove, the red eye of it pulsing gently. The wind outside sang low and mournful, rattling the shutters and brushing against the walls, as though to remind them that winter still reigned. But inside, in that small wooden world carved from wilderness and held together by habit, patience, and warmth, another day had passed. Not triumphantly, not memorably, but fully, lived from start to finish in quiet effort, quiet love, and quiet endurance. Water, so abundant in the warmer months, so easily gathered from the nearby creek or collected in barrels during summer storms, had now become a resource that demanded not just effort, but planning. Its scarcity not due to drought or distance, but simply because it had hardened into silence, frozen solid beneath a crust of white that held no softness, only stillness. Each droplet that had once trickled down from hills or pooled in shallow ruts of mud had, by midwinter, ceased to move at all, locked in place beneath inches of ice and snow, unreachable without steel, fire, or time. The creek, once lively with its chatter of flowing water and flickering reflections, now lay flat and blank beneath a frozen crust, its song muted, its surface smooth and cold, like glass pressed against the face of the earth. There had been a time, not long ago, when the family could fill their buckets with ease, when the creek's edge was soft and the water cold but willing. But that time had passed, quietly but completely, until the well-worn path to the stream became little more than a line drawn through snowdrifts, its end marked not by flowing water, but by the silence of a solid sheet of ice. Now, the man had to carry his axe not for trees, but for the river itself, its surface requiring the same force and repetition to break through. Each strike of the blade met with dull thud and a shiver up the handle. He would bend low after each few strikes, pause and to listen, to hear the difference in echo, the telltale change in tone that meant he was getting closer, that the frozen crust was giving way, that somewhere beneath the unyielding cold, water still moved. When the hole was finally made, the water revealed itself slowly, grudgingly, rising up with a kind of quiet reluctance, as a surprise to be summoned again to the surface. It was dark and still, rimmed with slush, and the edges of the hole began to crust over again almost immediately. The the wind eager to undo the effort as soon as it had been completed. The man had only moments to lower the bucket, to fill it as best he could, to lift it out with care, so that the freezing water wouldn't soak his gloves or freeze to the rope. 1 bucket was never enough. 2 was rarely sufficient. And each trip meant another breaking of the crust, another negotiation with the cold. There were days when the snow had to serve instead, when the creek was too far, or the wind too sharp, or the man too tired to make the journey. Then, the family would gather snow from the cleanest drifts near the cabin, scraping it from places untouched by boot or hoof, piling it into pots and kettles, and setting it atop the stove to melt. But snow was deceptive. It looked full. It looked abundant. Yet once it melted, it offered only a fraction of what it had promised. A bucket full of snow might yield only a cup of water, maybe less, depending on its texture, its age, its purity. And so the process became constant, a quiet choreography of collecting, melting, pouring, cooling, saving. The stove worked not just to warm the air and cook the meals, but to turn solid white back into something fluid and usable, to coax water back into the world. The melted snow had its own character. Soft, sometimes gritty, occasionally tinged with bits of bark or flecks of ash from the fire. But it was precious all the same. It was used for washing, for rinsing, for scrubbing vegetables, for boiling porridge, for steeping herbs. The water was poured from jar bowl to kettle, warmed, cooled, warmed again. Even the rinsing water, once used, was not discarded carelessly. It was poured outside only when it served all possible uses, and even then not flung, but laid gently in a corner of the yard, so that it would not form dangerous ice near the doorway. Every droplet had its place. Every movement with water was measured, thoughtful, slow. Bathing was no longer a frequent indulgence, but matter of necessity, approached with both frugality and care. A shallow basin near the stove, a kettle of warm water, a cloth wrung gently. This was the extent of cleanliness in winter. The water cooled quickly, the steam rising in curls that caught the lamplight, and the act was never hurried, but never prolonged. Hair was washed sparingly, with melted snow and handmade soap that cracked slightly in the dry air. The children were cleaned one at a time, wrapped immediately afterward in thick towels, pulled close to the stove so that no shiver would deepen into something more dangerous. The cold affected everything about the water, even the storage. Barrels kept indoors had to be refilled constantly, for they never held enough. Barrels left outside froze solid, their contents expanding until the staves cracked. Sometimes, the family used old crockery or wide-mouthed glass jars set near the fire to store small amounts for immediate use, rotating them as the fire ebbed and flowed. The constant challenge was not only to obtain water, but to keep it in liquid form, to guard from returning to stillness before it had fulfilled its purpose. There was no luxury in it, but there was rhythm. The family learned, without needing to ask, when the buckets needed refilling, when the snow needed melting, when the pot on the stove needed refilling. It was not a task assigned to one person, but a shared responsibility, passed wordlessly from hand to hand, day to day. Even the children grew aware of the subtle signs, the lightness of a pail, the slow hiss of the kettle running dry, the sound of water sloshing too low in the cookpot. These things mattered more than the date, more than the time. They were the measures by which the household ran. And when, occasionally, they had just a little more water than they needed, when the buckets were full and the fire burned hot enough to keep a pot of water warm for hours, they would allow themselves a small grace. A steaming cloth laid across the face after supper, a soak of tired feet wrapped in thick socks, a gentle washing of hands before bedtime, fingers lingering just a little longer in the warmth. These were not luxuries in the usual sense. They were blessings, earned through effort and passed down as kindness, one quiet act at a time. Outside, the snow continued to fall, not in flurries, not in storms, but in the slow, even descent that filled every crack and hollow with silence. And within that silence, the family endured, warmed not only by fire, but by their own steady rhythm, their own shared tasks, their own reverence for the simple, unyielding act of melting snow into water and turning effort into life. As the days drifted into one another and the landscape remained unchanged beneath its thick and frozen hush, a different kind of weight began to settle over the household. Not a snow, nor cold, nor even a hunger, but a quiet, internal heaviness that moved more slowly than any wind and clung more closely than any frost. It was not sadness exactly, nor fear, nor despair, but something hard to name, a dulling of the senses, a thickening of thought, a creeping stillness in the mind that mirrored the world outside. With each dawn that brought no real sun, and each evening that seemed to come too quickly, there grew a strange soft pressure in the chest, a restlessness without direction, a longing not for escape, but for movement, for change, for the simple stir of something new. Inside the cabin, where the same walls greeted the eye every morning and the same chairs creaked beneath the same bodies every night, the mind began to retreat inward, for the body had nowhere to go, no paths to follow, no fresh air to greet the lungs unless one braved the cold just for the sake of it. And even then, the world beyond the door was only whiteness and wind and the muffled sound of one's own footsteps. So instead, the mind wandered, slowly at first, drifting from memory to memory like a bird circling over familiar trees, then deeper, into thoughts unspoken, into dreams long shelved, into questions left unanswered by the routines of daily labor. The mother, always so steady in her tasks, began to notice the silence more than she used to, the lack of birdsong in the trees, the absence of neighbors' voices on the breeze, the way even laughter inside the cabin had grown softer, less frequent. She still hummed while she cooked, but the tunes were slower now, and sometimes unfinished. She would pause mid-stitch, her needle dangling, eyes fixed on the window though there was nothing new to see, only the same stretch of snow, the same crooked fence post, the same outline of bare trees against a pewter sky. She thought of letters left unanswered, of places she had once hoped to visit, of the days before children, before marriage, when the world had seemed wider, when winters had felt romantic instead of relentless. The man, though tireless in his chores, felt the days grow longer inside his head. He began waking in the middle of the night, not from cold or noise, but from dreams he couldn't remember, only the unease they left behind. He would sit by the stove, staring into the dying fire, listening to the house breathe and creak, and think about things he hadn't thought of in years. His father's old farm, long since sold. The brother who had gone east and never returned. The summer when the creek had overflowed and taken part of the field. He didn't speak of these things. There was no use in doing so. But they stayed with him now, like shadows that had found their way indoors. The children, too, felt the slow closing in of winter, though they lacked the words for it. Their games became quieter, their laughter more restrained. They no longer asked when they might visit the neighbors, when they might ride into town, when the snow might melt. They knew, as children on the frontier always seemed to know, when something was futile. Instead, they stared longer into the fire, traced their fingers over the frost on the window panes, watched the patterns form and disappear. They whispered stories to each other at night, invented creatures that lived beneath the snow, imagined worlds where spring had never ended. These tales were not sad, but they were not happy either. They were something in between, gentle, strange, sleepy diversions spun from the hush of too many still hours. There were small things, too, that changed in the silence. Meals took longer to prepare, not because the ingredients required it, but because the time needed filling. The mending pile remained half done, not from laziness, but from the creeping sense that there would always be more hours ahead in which to finish. Books were read and reread until the pages felt memorized, and stories were told not because they were new, but because they were familiar. Familiarity became the only kind of comfort available. And then, too, there was the cabin itself. In the deep of winter, it no longer felt like a place that merely held them, but like something alive, something that pressed back against their thoughts, that held their echoes a little too long, that swallowed their voices and gave nothing back. The walls, once protective, now felt close. The ceiling seemed lower. Even the warmth from the stove sometimes felt too heavy, clinging to skin in a way that made breath harder to take. There was no danger, not truly. But the mind does not always wait for danger to make itself known. It moves ahead, anticipates, invents. On the hardest days, the hours passed in quiet drift. The chores were still done, the fire still fed, the food still cooked, but with fewer words, slower movements, longer silences. The window became a place of watching, not for any expected visitor, but for the possibility of something, anything, changing. A bird, perhaps returned too early. A shadow in the trees. A strange shape in the snow. But mostly there was nothing. Only the world, still and pale, unchanged. And yet, within that stillness, something else took root. Not hope, not yet, but endurance. A quiet strength born not of joy or comfort, but of patience. The mother still rose each morning. The father still chopped wood. The children still played, even if less loudly. The snow still fell. The days still passed. And the silence, though deep and wide, had not yet swallowed them. They breathed. They listened. They waited. And in waiting they endured. Beyond the warmth of the cabin walls, out where the snow stood deep enough to hide the broken outline of last summer's garden fence, and the wind moved through the trees with voice lower than any man's, the animals endured their own long season of hardship. Silent companions to the family struggle, their needs just as constant, their vulnerability more visible in the way they stood, the way they breathed, the way their eyes searched the world with a patience that seemed both ancient and immediate. There were not many of them, just a cow, a pair of chickens, a mule, and a dog, but each held a place in the household's fragile balance, each requiring food, shelter, and attention, and offering, in return, not only utility but a sense of companionship that softened the cold in a way that blankets and firewood could not. The mule, old but steady, stood beneath the lean-to beside the barn, its coat grown thick and matted with frost, its breath billowing into morning air in soft clouds that hung for a moment before vanishing into the wider cold. It did not bray or stomp or shiver. It simply stood, as it stood every winter for years, shifting its weight now and then, its ears flicking at the sounds of the wind. The man checked on it every morning, brushing ice from its back, breaking the crust on a bucket of water, speaking to it in a low voice that carried no urgency but only acknowledgement. It was not a conversation, not truly, but it was a habit, a ritual between man and beast that reminded them both that neither was alone. The cow, a sturdy brown thing with a slow gaze and a heavy breath, stayed in the small barn where the straw was piled thick and the air held the faintest trace of warmth, not from fire, but from the slow, moist breath of living things confined together. Her udders no longer gave milk in any generous measure, for the season had slowed everything, even her, but the children still came to her with a pail each day, coaxing what little they could, their hands cold but careful, their voices quiet as they worked. She stood still as they moved, chewing slowly, eyes half-lidded, swaying with the rhythm of the task, her body swaddled in the soft light that leaked in through the gaps in the boards. She did not need to speak to be understood. Her breathing, the angle of her ears, the twitch of her tail, all these were enough to say that she was cold, yes, and tired, but not afraid. She knew this winter, had lived others, and would live through this one too, if given care and hay and time. The chickens, fewer than there had once been, stayed in a small coop packed with straw, their combs pale from the cold, their feathers fluffed out so wide they seemed like little heaps of brown and gray wool. They clucked now and then, not loudly, just enough to announce that they were there, that the feed had arrived, that a scrap of bread had been noticed and appreciated. Egg-laying had slowed to almost nothing, and the family no longer looked to the nesting boxes with daily expectation. But even so, each visit to the coop held the possibility of surprise, and now and then, in the early light, the mother would find one small, smooth egg resting like a secret beneath the straw, its shell warm from the body that had left it. She would carry it inside wrapped in her apron, holding it close not just for warmth, but for gratitude, a reminder that life continued in quiet ways even now. The dog, of course, was different. He did not work like the mule, nor provide milk like the cow, nor eggs like the chickens. His role was older, more abstract, woven into the family like a shadow that moved when they moved, slept when they slept, and watched when they were too tired to notice what might be outside the window. He lay by the stove, belly to the warm boards, his ears twitching even in sleep. And when the father rose in the middle of the night, or the wind grew stronger than usual, or a sound came from the woods that did not belong to the trees, the dog would lift his head slowly, look toward the door, and wait. He did not bark unless there was cause. He did not whimper unless pain made him. He was not pet, not toy, not child. He was presence, a reminder of the outer world, the forest beyond a fence, the animals whose eyes shone in the night. And yet he belonged, utterly within the circle of firelight. Tending to the animals was not optional. Even on the worst mornings, even when the snow had blown in sideways and the door had to be shoved open with both arms braced against the jamb. The man wrapped his scarf around his mouth, pulled his coat tight, and walked the same path he walked every day since the frost first came, his boots crunching in the silence, the snow clinging to his beard, the cold slipping between the folds of his clothing like water. He never lingered, but neither did he rush. There was dignity in the way he opened the barn door, in the way he moved from stall to coop to lean-to, his hands always busy, his voice always low, never angry, never impatient. The animals had come to know this rhythm, and they trusted it. It was a thing you could see, in the way they responded, in the way they leaned toward him, in the way they stood still while he worked. Feeding them was its own ritual. Hay from the loft, slowly dwindling, yet still present. A bucket of grain, carefully measured, not spilled. Water from a house, warm when possible, carried by hand and ladled slowly so it would not crack the frozen troughs. The routine never varied, because it could not. These animals had no way of asking for help, no means of fending for themselves. They gave what they could and took only what they needed, and in return, they asked for the simplest kindnesses: warmth, food, water, and the nearness of a human voice. In the evenings, when the chores were done and the last pail was empty and the doors were latched against the wind, the family would speak now and then to the animals, not in great detail, but with familiarity. The mule had been steady today. The cow had moved more slowly than usual. The chickens had made no sound. And sometimes, though not often, one of the children would ask what would happen if the cold did not lift, if the hay ran out, if the cow could not stand, if the coop grew too cold. The parents would answer honestly, but without alarm. They had seen hard winters before, and if the worst came, they would do what must be done. But for now, the animals stood. They breathed. They endured. That was enough. And so, beneath the same sky that hung heavy over the cabin, and within the same snow that pressed down on roofs and fences alike, the animals lived alongside the family, not as burden, not as resource, but as fellow survivors. They moved through their days with no complaint, no language, only presence. And in their steady breathing, in the frost on their whiskers, and the warmth of their bodies huddled together against the cold, they offered a kind of quiet faith that spring would come again, that the sun would rise higher, that the snow would melt not all at once, but little by little, as it always had. There were few things more feared on the frontier during winter than the creeping arrival of illness, for in the deep cold, when every corner of the world outside had frozen into stillness and every breath was visible in the air, a cough could echo louder than a storm, and a fever could burn hotter than any fire a family could manage. It came quietly, as most dangerous things do. Just a small shiver at first, a touch of warmth of cheek, or a sudden flush that stood out too sharply against the pale skin of a child who had seemed well enough just the day before. It did not roar into the room like a wind, or crash like a tree beneath heavy snow. It crept in on the back of breath, through the folds of the blanket, in the stillness of night, unnoticed at first, until the sounds changed, the voice weaker, the movement slower, the quiet deeper. There were no doctors nearby, and even if there had been one within a few miles, the roads were gone now, vanished beneath snowdrifts so high and deep they seemed not to cover ground but to have replaced it altogether. There were no calls for help, no midnight rides for medicine, no town apothecary to fetch a remedy from. The family had only what they had always had, what they had prepared, what they had grown, what they had dried and stored and hidden in the corners of cupboards and shelves. Their medicine was not wrapped in paper or stored in bottles with labels. It was brewed in clay mugs, steeped in silence, and passed from hand to hand with a kind of reverence that made even the simplest broth or tea feel like a sacred offering. It was the youngest child first, a boy of 7, thin and small, with the sort of pale hair that always looked mussed even when combed. One morning, he did not rise when called. He stirred slightly, but did not open his eyes. The mother touched his forehead, and the warmth beneath her palm was immediate and unnatural, not the warmth of sleep, but of something deeper, something fierce. She said nothing at first, only covered him again with the thickest quilt they had, and moved more quickly than usual in her chores. Her face remained calm, but her hands moved with purpose. She added more wood to the fire. She put water to boil. She opened the drawer that held the herbs. Dried peppermint for fever, willow bark for pain, a small twist of dried elderflower wrapped in muslin for sweating. The father brought in extra wood and stacked it close to the stove. He did not speak either, not because he did not worry, but because there was nothing to say. They had lived too many winters to waste words on what they could not change. The child was sick. That was the truth. And so they would do what must be done. The older children were hushed, not by command but by the heavy air of the cabin, which now moved more slowly, more carefully, as though afraid to disturb the illness resting in the small bed in the corner. They sat near the fire, reading with quiet voices, mending clothes they had mended before, occasionally glancing toward the bed, toward their brother's motionless form. The boy did not wake fully that day. He drank what was given to him, warm water, bitter tea, and thin broth from the boiled bones of the last chicken they had killed before the snow came. He did not speak. He coughed now and then, a dry, rasping sound that made everyone pause, not in alarm, but in deepening silence. The mother kept a damp cloth at his forehead, changed often, warm between her palms. She sat beside him for hours, sometimes knitting with her eyes on the needles, sometimes simply watching the rise and fall of his breath, her lips moving without sound, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in calculation. That night, sleep did not come easily. The mother stayed awake, dozing in her chair when she could, starting at each new sound. The shift of the logs in the stove, the rustle of blankets, the sharp break of a cough. She lit the lamp more than once, refilled the kettle, checked the child's breath with her ear close to his mouth. The fire was kept alive through constant tending. The light never left the corner where the child lay. In the rest of the cabin there was stillness, but not rest. Even those who slept lightly, ears open to the room, hearts beating more quickly than usual. By morning, the fever had broken, not entirely, but enough. The flush faded. The boy's lips moved. He drank with less prompting. He opened his eyes. The mother allowed herself to smile, just once, briefly, and only after she was certain. The worst had passed. Not over, but past. And in the quiet that followed, the cabin breathed again. But the relief was short-lived, because as is often the way with illness in close quarters, it moved from one body to the next with the same slow, quiet relentlessness. The girl, the oldest child, barely 13, was next. Her illness was not as strong, but the worry was the same. She coughed in the night. She lost her appetite. She shivered beneath her shawl and tried to hide it. The mother noticed. Always. And so the cycle began again. Tea, cloth, broth, watching. The fire never went cold. The water never left the stove. The father began to move more slowly, too. And though he never said aloud, the mother could see the weight in his shoulders, the exhaustion gathering behind his eyes. There was a kind of rhythm to it, once it began. Illness became part of the household routine, a quiet shadow that slipped in and out of the days, stealing energy, but never hope, not fully. And in that rhythm, the family adapted. They learned to move without needing to speak. The children understood what to fetch, what to heat, what to hand over. The mother kept her voice low and even. The father worked more outside, letting his worry burn itself off in the cold. The herbs dwindled, one by one. The peppermint was gone. The elderflower nearly so. The last of the honey was scraped from the bottom of the jar, added to tea to soothe a throat that refused to heal. But even in the grip of illness, the family did not despair. There was no time for it, no room for it in a place where every effort had to be directed toward survival. There were no dramatics, no tears shedding corners. Only quiet care, offered without question. A hand at the forehead, a cup held to the lips, a chair moved closer to the fire. This was how they weathered the sick days, not through strength or medicine, but through presence, through simply being there, night after night, hour after hour, minute by minute, until the fever broke, the cough eased, and the breath returned to its quiet, steady rhythm. When the worst it was over, and the family had returned to their daily routines, though slower, though wearier, there was no celebration, no declaration of victory, just a deep, collective exhale of those who had made it through one more trial, and knew there might still be more to come. The cabin felt heavier, Perhaps the air thicker, the fire quieter. But there was warmth, too, in the knowing that they had watched over one another, that they had not flinched or faltered, that in the long dark of winter they had held the line between sickness and silence. When night fell on the frontier during the hard winter, it did not fall gently nor suddenly, but seeped like ink dropped into still water, slowly deepening around the edges until the world beyond the windows dissolved into shadow, and the only things left visible were the flickering patterns cast by the firelight and the lamp's gentle glow. There was no twilight as in the softer seasons, no gradual dimming with the sun hanging lazily above the treetops. Winter darkness was quick to arrive and slow to leave, settling over the snow like a second skin, pressing close against the roof and the doors, muffling sound and deepening every silence into something that felt old, immense, and alive. Yet the darkness was not truly silent. Not ever. It was filled with voices, with creaks and howls and rustling whispers that emerged once the daylight had fully surrendered. And though the family inside the cabin rarely spoke of them, each one of them had learned the language of those sounds, had grown to recognize their patterns, their meanings, and the moods they carried on the breath of the wind. There were nights when the world seemed to hold its breath, and the snow muffled every movement until not even the trees dared stir. But on other nights, the dark came alive, and the noises outside became their own kind of weather, changing, shifting, surrounding the house like a tide that could never quite be seen. The first sound, always, was the wind. It began as a distant murmur, barely distinguishable from the low groan of the chimney draft or the whisper of a log settling in the stove. But as the hours grew later and the fire dimmed, the wind would grow bolder, curling around the cabin in long, sighing breaths that moved the shutters just slightly, enough to creak but not enough to open. It pressed against the corners of the house, testing the boards and the seams, tugging at the roof like a hand running its fingers through brittle thatch. It found its way beneath the eaves, along the door frame, down the narrow crack where the floorboards met the wall. It did not howl, not always, but it did speak, and its voice was old, hollow, endless. Then came the trees, tall and bare now, stripped of their leaves, their branches stretched into the sky like the ribs of some great, forgotten animal left to freeze on the edge of the forest. In the wind, they groaned and swayed, their limbs rubbing together, with deep, woody moan that rose and fell like breath. Occasionally, a sharp crack rang out, a limb breaking under the weight of snow, falling somewhere out of sight, thudding softly into the whiteness below. These were not frightening sounds, not truly, but they were reminders that the forest lived even in sleep, that even beneath the ice and hush, things moved, shifted, changed. The trees had seen many winters, and they whispered to one another in tones the cabin could not ignore. Sometimes on the clearest nights, when the wind died down and the stars gleamed in the blackness above like frozen sparks scattered by some passing god, there came the unmistakable cry of wolves. It began with a single call, long and low, rising from deep in the valley or far beyond the fields, almost too faint to notice at first, just a ripple in the quiet. But then another would answer, closer, sharper, lifting the hair on the back of the dog's neck and drawing a hush across the faces around the fire. Soon the whole pack would speak, a chorus of howls that curled over the hills and through the forest, weaving between the trees and across the frozen fields until the very air felt laced with longing and hunger. The wolves never came close. Not usually, but their voices traveled further than their paws could carry them, and the sound they made was one of both beauty and warning. It reminded the family that out there, in the same snow that blanketed their roof, life hunted, life suffered, life survived. The dog would rise when he heard them, not barking, never barking, but standing tall, ears forward, eyes fixed on the window as though he could see through the frost. He would listen, head tilted slightly, as though he understood the meaning behind the howls, as though they were messages meant for him. Sometimes he would growl low in his throat, not with anger, but with memory. He knew the scent of wolves. He knew their patterns, their sounds. And the family, watching him, trusted his reaction more than any story they had heard. If he lay back down, they knew the wolves were distant, busy elsewhere. If he remained standing, they knew to watch the doors and keep the fire strong. There were other sounds too, smaller, but no less strange. The tap of melting snow from the roof, now refrozen into hard, brittle icicles that clinked like glass when the wind nudged them. The soft shudder of snow sliding from the higher parts of the cabin, landing in sudden muffled thumps that startled the younger children awake. The sharp patter of unseen claws across the packed snow outside, where foxes or raccoons made their way in silence, looking for scraps, for weakness, for warmth. Sometimes, when the wind stilled completely, they could hear the distant crack of the frozen creek, the ice shifting beneath the pressure of its own depth, breaking not apart but deeper into itself, echoing like a bell beneath the earth. Inside the cabin, these sounds were part of the nightly ritual. As familiar as the groan of the stove or the sigh of the settling beams, they did not stir panic, but neither were they ignored. The parents would listen carefully each evening, measuring the night not by time, but by tone. A sharp wind meant restless sleep. A quiet forest meant a good night to open the shutters and let in a bit of moonlight. A chorus of wolves meant caution. A sudden silence, unnatural and complete, meant something else entirely. Something watching, something near. But even in the eeriness of those winter nights, there was comfort to be found. The sounds meant that the world still turned, that the forest had not gone quiet forever. They were reminders that they were not alone, not the only ones enduring. And in that thought, strange though it seemed, there was warmth. The children sometimes asked, in hushed voices, what the wolves were saying. The father would answer with the same story each time, that the wolves were calling to the moon, telling her to know of the stars, of the long walk through the trees and the rabbit they almost caught. The children would smile, sleep tugging at their lashes, and close their eyes to that thought, a story told in howls, shared across miles, echoing through the dark like lullabies too wild to be sung in human tongues. And as the fire dimmed and the logs collapsed into glowing embers, and the family slept beneath their heavy quilts, the cabin stood firm against the night, surrounded by trees that whispered, by animals that roamed, by a sky filled with cold stars and ancient quiet. And in all that noise, the moan of the wind, the creak of the eaves, the distant cry of wolves, there was strangely peace. For they knew these sounds. They knew their meanings. And so long as those voices remained, so long as the night still sang, it meant the world was still awake, still moving, still holding on, just as they were. Once the darkness had fully settled over the landscape and the last of the outside sounds had receded into a comfortable distance, when the wind quieted and the fire gave off a steady, even heat, the family turned to the one tradition that neither winter nor hardship could steal: storytelling. It was not scheduled, not announced, not even expected some nights. But when the air inside the cabin had grown still enough, and the silence between the scraping of bowls and the cracking of logs had stretched long enough to be noticed, someone, usually one of the children, with a hopeful glance toward their father or mother, would speak the same simple words that had been whispered for years across many cold seasons. Tell us a story. There was no need to ask what kind. The stories told in winter were always the same kind, in their own way, slow, patient, winding things, told with a calm voice and pauses that let the fire fill in the spaces between sentences. They were not grand or heroic, not loud or frightening. No one leapt from cliffs, no battles were fought, and no kingdoms changed hands. These were not tales to stir the blood or raise the heart. They were stories meant to stretch time, to pass it gently, like a worn quilt handed from lap to lap. They were memories half true and half made, stories from old homesteads or even older countries, or sometimes places that never existed at all, save in the quiet corners of the teller's imagination. The father often began with a small clearing of his throat, a glance at the fire, a sip of whatever warm drink remained in his tin cup. He never began with "once upon a time," for that would have sounded too grand, too far removed from their world. Instead, he would begin with a place. There was a little cabin not far from here, or back when your grandfather was a boy, or up in the high hills, where the snow stayed longer than it does even here. And from that small beginning, the tale would grow, not quickly but patiently, like ice forming on a pane of glass, spreading out in quiet, intricate lines that caught the light in unexpected ways. The stories often involved people not unlike themselves: a boy with frostbitten fingers who learned to trap foxes, a girl who made a whistle from pine wood and could call birds from the trees, a couple who built a house from stone during a season when even the rivers had frozen solid. Sometimes animals spoke. Sometimes ghosts appeared, but only the gentle kind, the kind that walked old floors or watched from the woods, Never harmful, only sad or curious or waiting. Sometimes the stories ended with surprise, but more often they simply stopped when they had run out of snow or night or breath. No one minded. It was not the ending that mattered, but the telling. The mother, too, had her stories. Quieter still, woven more with feeling than with plot. She told of places from her childhood. The smell of apples stored in the cellar, the way moonlight lit the floorboards in her parent house, the silence after a snowfall that came so heavy it erased the sound of footsteps. Her voice had a rhythm to it, not musical exactly, but smooth and slow, like a lullaby spoken rather than sung. The children leaned into it, eyes half-lidded, faces warmed by firelight and softened by weariness. Her words were like the steam rising from a mug, visible, fleeting, and somehow comforting just by being there. The children sometimes told stories, too, especially when the night stretched longer than usual and the parents' voices had grown hoarse from the day. Their tales were stranger, more jumbled, filled with talking bears and magical stones, with journeys that happened all in one afternoon and ended in a feast of endless stew and biscuits that never ran out. The others listened with small smiles, never correcting, never rushing, letting the children wander down whatever path their young minds built. These stories did not follow rules, and that was their charm. They offered the chance to pretend, to escape, to live for just a moment in a world where cold could be banished with a wave of the hand, and wolves could be tamed with a song. Some nights, when the snow fell thick and heavy against the window panes and the wind wailed through cracks in the walls like a lost thing searching for home, the stories grew older, deeper, quieter. The father would speak of ancestors whose names had nearly been forgotten, of uncles who had vanished during blizzards and never returned, of great-grandmothers who could tell the weather by the way the tea leaves settled in a cup. These stories were told in fewer words, but they lingered longer in the air. They were not for entertainment, but for anchoring, for reminding the family that their struggle was not new, not isolated, not hopeless. Others had sat beside other fires in other winters, and had made it through. These tales were ropes thrown backward in time, and each word tied them a little more firmly to the long, quiet line of those who had endured before them. When the fire had burned low and the children's eyes had closed without them realizing, when the dog had curled tighter by the hearth and the last log had split softly in the flames, the stories would trail off into silence. Not a sharp silence, but a smooth one, like the final note of a lullaby fading into night. No one clapped, no one marked the end. The words simply stopped, and the warmth of them lingered, like smoke in the rafters or steam from a cooling bowl. And in that silence, filled not with emptiness but with the gentle weight of spoken memory, the family would drift into sleep one by one. The snow continued to fall outside. The wind brushed against the cabin like a hand passing over a blanket. But inside, the stories had drawn their circle, had built their quiet fortification against the cold. And so, wrapped in a glow of words and warmth, the household rested, not fearless, but unafraid, not safe from winter, but steady within it. There are some mornings in a long winter that feel different from the moment one opens her eyes, though at first there is no clear reason why. The air inside the cabin remains cold enough to see one's breath. The stove has burned low overnight, the wooden beams still groan in the same tired, familiar way, and yet there is something, a softness in the light, perhaps, or a quiet absence in the usual wind, or maybe just a feeling that settles into the skin before thought can give it shape. And on this particular morning, after so many days blurred into each other under the same gray sky, the family awoke to a hush that was not the silence of snow or weariness or stillness, but the silence of possibility. The father was the first to rise, as he always was, stretching from beneath the heavy quilt with a grunt that half broke the silence and half joined it. He rubbed his hands together, shuffled across the creaking boards toward the stove, and began the familiar task of rekindling the fire. But when he reached the firewood stack by the door, his hand froze mid-reach, not from cold, but from surprise. For across the floor, through the seams between the door and the frame, a shaft of golden light had spilled, thin and tentative, but unmistakably warm in its hue, unlike the usual steely gleam of sunless snow reflection. He moved toward the window, brushing away the frost with the sleeve of his shirt, his breath fogging the glass again as quickly as he cleared it. But what he saw on the other side drew from him a sound, half breath, half word, that made the mother stir behind him. Outside, the sky was blue, not the pale, sickly blue of thawing ice, but a deep, vivid, expansive blue that stretched from one end of the clearing to the other, unmarred by cloud, unmarred by storm. The snow that lay over the field, the roof, the trees, all of it sparkled, not with the dull gray sheen of overcast days, but with sharp, bright flashes of reflected sun, as though the world itself had been polished overnight. He stood there for a long time, just watching, as though the view might change if he blinked or turned away too soon. When the mother joined him, her eyes widened only slightly, but the corners of her mouth turned upward in the smallest of smiles. She did not speak, but she laid her hand on his arm, and in that gesture was a shared recognition of something sacred. The sun had returned. Not forever, perhaps not even for long, but it was there. Soon the cabin stirred. The children rose, groggy at first, their eyes half closed as they shivered into their clothes. But as the first of them noticed the unusual brightness flooding through the cracks in the shutters, the mood changed. There was a rustling of excitement, a subtle shift from resignation to wonder. Even the dog rose more quickly than usual, his ears perked, his nose pressed to the bottom of the door as if he, too, could sense that something outside had changed. Breakfast was made with less haste that morning, not because there was more to eat, but because the ritual itself felt lighter. The fire burned hotter, and the room filled with the soft golden glow of the sun, not yet high in the sky, but determined nonetheless. They ate slowly, glancing often toward the windows, smiling at nothing in particular, speaking more freely than they had in days. Laughter came more easily, and when the meal was finished, the father stood and said, "Let's go see it." They bundled up as they always did, layer after layer of wool and fur, scarves wrapped high on the cheeks, mittens pulled tight. But this time, the act felt more like preparation for a celebration than armor for battle. The door, when opened, flooded the room with a light so bright it startled them, and for a moment they stood blinking on the threshold, their eyes adjusting, their bodies catching up with what their hearts already felt. Warmth, however faint, was returning. The snow crunched beneath their boots with a different sound, less brittle, more yielding. The sky overhead arched wide and clean, and every branch of every tree was outlined in light, as though etched in fire. The children laughed aloud, their voices sharp in the air, not muffled by wind or dread. The oldest made a snowball, soft and wet and easy to form. She tossed it gently at her brother, who shrieked with delight and returned fire. The mother tilted her head back, closed her eyes, and let the sun touch her eyelids. The father stood still, breathing deeply, the lines in his face softening. Even the animals responded. The chickens clucked with more energy. The cows shifted toward the sun's direction, standing near the barn door as if trying to drink in the light. The mule pawed gently at the ground and blinked more often, as if disbelieving. The dog bounded through the snow, barking once, then once again, before settling into a long gallop around the clearing, his fur catching the sun and turning gold. It was not warm, not truly. The air still stung when they breathed too deeply, and the snow showed no sign of melting. But in that sunlight was a memory of warmth, the promise of thaw. It cast long shadows across the yard, outlined the trees in silver, and turned the edges of the roof into a cascade of tiny drips and sparkles. They stood in it as long as they could bear, soaking up the light as if it were food, as if it could fill the hollow places that cold had carved inside them. Later, when they returned indoors, cheeks flushed and noses red, the cabin itself felt transformed. The same walls, the same stove, the same sagging chairs, but brighter now, every surface touched with daylight. The children took off their boots and mittens and sat close to the fire, not because they were chilled, but because it was part of the ritual, and rituals bring comfort. The parents exchanged glances, soft ones, full of meaning. No words were needed. That night, as the sun dipped once again below the tree line and the blue sky deepened into dusk, they felt the return of shadow less keenly, for they had seen the sun, not in memory, not in dream, but truly seen it, felt on their faces, watched it dance on the snow, and though they knew it might not return again for days or weeks, its brief visit had shifted something within them, had added a kind of warmth that no fire could provide. The story that night, told softly as the fire hissed and cracked, was about the first day of spring. Not spring itself, but the very first day of it. when the snow was still deep and the wind still sharp, but a single green shoot poked through the ground. The children listened with glowing eyes, and when they slept, they dreamed not of wolves or hunger or cold, but of open skies, running water, and the light that had returned, even if only for a little while. In the heart of winter, once the days had begun to blur together and the walls of the cabin held a stillness, so familiar it no longer registered, the family turned their attention inward, not just toward the fire and food and health, but toward the small, necessary tasks that filled the quiet hours with purpose. These were not tasks of survival in the urgent sense, not chopping wood or fetching water, not tending animals or stoking the stove, but the slower, quieter work that made survival less brittle, more bearable, and perhaps even, at times, gentle. They were the chores of mending, of fixing, of making do, not heroic in nature, not remembered in stories, but deeply woven into the fabric of frontier life, carried out in silence or murmur conversation, while snow pressed against the window panes and wind-shaped soft drifts against the door. It began, usually, in the lull after breakfast and morning chores, once the coldest part of the day had passed and the fire had settled into a steady rhythm. The sun, if it showed at all, sat low in the sky, sending its pale light across the floor in narrow bands that moved almost imperceptibly from wall to wall as the hours crept by. The table was cleared of dishes and wiped with the corner of a cloth. And then, slowly, the tools of this quieter work were laid out, baskets of spools and thread, worn bits of leather, buttons saved from old coats, needles bent from use but still sharp enough to do their work. The children fetched what needed repair. Mittens with loose cuffs, trousers thin at the knees, socks worn nearly through at the heels. And in this way, the cabin became not a place of mere waiting, but of quiet renewal. The mother took her place near the fire, where the light was best and the warmth constant, her sewing basket beside her, her fingers already moving before the others had fully gathered their things. She did not rush. Her stitches were small and even, almost invisible once finished, and she hummed softly to herself as she worked. Not a song with words, but a sound to fill the space between her thoughts. The father, nearby, set to his own kind of mending, oiling the hinges of tools that had stiffened in the cold, reshaping the handles of shovels and hoes with his whittling knife, tightening the bindings on sled runners, or fashioning new straps from scraps of harness leather. His work was quieter still, filled with long pauses, thoughtful examination, and the occasional sigh when a splint would prove too deep to fix or a blade too dull to save. The children, too, found their part in this afternoon ritual, each according to their age and skill. The older girl had taken to knitting, her hands not yet as fast as her mother's, but nimble enough to form long, uneven scarves that grew slowly between her fingers, their lumps and crooked rows softened by the warmth of her intent. The boy worked on carving, small pieces would whittled into animals, people, or abstract shapes that pleased him, his blade dull but safe, and his focus so complete that he did not notice the passing of time. The younger one sorted buttons by size and color, or matched socks, or folded cloth into neat piles. None of it was urgent, none of it dramatic, but all of it mattered. There was comfort in this shared work, comfort in the rhythm of it, the low scrape of knife on wood, the whisper thread pulling through wool, the occasional mutter when a stitch snagged or a needle slipped, and the fire always murmuring beneath it all. The hours passed without clock or calendar, marked only by the angle of the sunlight on the wall, or the way the stove needed feeding again, or the sound of the animals shifting outside in their stalls. And though the wind sometimes howled against the cabin, rattling the shutters and sending little flurries of frosted cracks in the wall, inside the world was smaller, quieter, focused. There were breaks, of course. When hands grew stiff or eyes grew tired, the family would stop and take a moment to sip warm broth or nibble on a slice of dried apple or bread. During these pauses, they would talk. Not always of serious things, but of memories, of what spring might bring, of the way the snow looked like sugar on the roof, of a bird they'd seen at the edge of the forest that morning, standing too still for too long. These conversations were not loud or lengthy, but soft and slow, stretching like the rest of the day, wrapping gently around the room and settling into the corners. Sometimes, while sewing a sleeve or mending a hole in a quilt, the mother would tell a story, not one of magic or adventure, but one tied to the item in her hands. She might recall the day the trousers were first worn, or the time the quilt had been used for a picnic before they moved west, or how a particular patch of fabric had once belonged to her own mother's dress. In this way, the act of mending became not just practical, but personal. Each repair kind of remembering, each stitch a small defiance against forgetting. The father, too, would sometimes pause his work to point out something to the children, the way a knot would show the age of the tree, or how a certain kind of grain meant the tool handle would split, if not sanded just so, or how leather softened when warm near the stove. He did not explain these things as lessons, not exactly, but the children listened all the same, absorbing the knowledge as naturally as they breathed, storing it somewhere deep where it would wait until needed years from now, in cabins of their own, on other cold afternoons. By the time the sun had slipped behind the trees and the light in the cabin turned to gold and then to gray, the pile of mended clothes had grown, the tools had been polished and set back in place, and the scraps of thread and cloth had been swept into a neat pile for the stove. The fire was fed again, the kettle put on to boil, and the work of the day was folded away with quiet satisfaction. No one cheered. No one marked the completion of the tasks with any celebration. But there was a calmness to the room now, a sense that something had been tended, not just objects, but time itself, made softer and more bearable by the gentle hands that shaped it. And in the hush that followed, as night returned and the outside world faded once again into darkness, the family settled near the fire, warmed not only by its heat, but by the knowledge that they had preserved what they could, that nothing had been wasted, and that even in the bleakest part of the season, there was still meaning to be found in the quiet repair of simple things. On the American frontier, in the deep grip of a long and frozen winter, the passage of time did not arrive in the tidy procession of numbers printed on a calendar or the ticking precision of a clock on the wall. For there were no calendars on the wall, and no clock whose hands turned with dependable rhythm. Time was not something measured in hours or dates, but rather something felt, something noticed in the body and the light, in the breath that hung longer in the air, in the shadow that moved just slightly differently across the wooden floor. In winter, especially, time became quiet and elastic, slipping softly between chores and meals, between sunrise and the dimming gray of late afternoon, never clearly marked and rarely questioned. The family did not live by a schedule. They lived by rhythm, by routine, and by the small signs that told them that another day had passed, even if it looked much the same as the one before it. Morning began not at a fixed hour, but with the cold. The first to rise was always the father, though even he did not rise with an alarm or a clear signal. He rose because the stove had gone out, and the cold had crept into his bones, waking him gently but insistently, the way cold always wakes those who must work to keep it at bay. He stirred beneath the covers, listening first to the silence, to the creak of the beams, to the faint hiss of wind against the roof, and then moved quietly across the floor, careful not to wake the others, gathering wood and coaxing the fire back to life. The return of warmth marked the beginning of the day. Not the sun, not a bell, not the sound of anything outside, but the fire and the way it slowly pushed the cold away from the corners of the room. The children rose once the room had warmed slightly, their bodies still wrapped in the slowness of sleep. There was no rush to the day's beginning, only the steady procession of small tasks, dressing in layers, folding the quilts, rubbing sleep from their eyes with mittened hands. Breakfast was eaten not at 7 or 8 or 9, but simply after the stove was hot enough to boil water and cook porridge, after the bread had been sliced and the butter scraped from the crock. If the sky was light when they sat down, they called it morning. If it was darkening already, they called it late. Time was not argued with. It was accepted, and yet, for all its softness, time did leave traces, and the family had found their own ways of keeping track. Not with instruments, but with instinct and observation, with memory and subtle markers placed in the world around them. There was a candle. For instance, the one they burned each night after supper, not for light, so much as for passage. The candle was thick, hand-poured from tallow and beeswax, and it burned slowly. Each night, they lit it once the dishes were done, and let it burn for time while they sat near the fire, speaking or mending or simply being quiet together. The candle's progress became its own form of clock. Let's let it burn down 1 thumb width, the mother might say, and that meant perhaps 20 minutes or 30 or a little more. It did not matter exactly. The important thing was the pattern, the ritual, the shared understanding. Then there were the shadows. The father had once marked a line on the floor, where the light fell through the south-facing window in the middle of winter when the sun was at its lowest. He had marked it with a scratch, just barely visible in the wood, and then another further down the board for when the sun began to climb again as spring edged closer. Each day, just after noon, he would glance at the floor to see where the shadow lay. Was it shorter than yesterday? Longer? Did it fall closer to the window now? Or further into the room? This was how he knew the season's pace, how he could tell the children that the worst was nearly over, that the sun was slowly, quietly, returning to its place. Meals also shaped the day, not in fixed intervals, but in rhythm. There was breakfast after the fire, a midday bite when the stomach reminded them it had been some time since the last, and supper once the chores had all been done and the light outside began to fade. No one looked at a clock to determine when to eat. The cold did that work for them, and hunger was a better timekeeper than any bell. In fact, the passing of time often revealed itself most clearly through the food itself. How much bread was left, how many potatoes remained, how thin the stew had become. A dwindling pantry was a calendar of its own, telling not only how long winter had already lasted, but how much longer it might yet stretch. Other signs came in quieter ways. The children kept track of the days since the last snowfall by counting the icicles on the eaves, how many had formed, how many had fallen, how thick they had grown. They counted animal tracks in the snow each morning, learning to tell rabbit from fox, deer from squirrel, and knowing that certain prints meant that warmer days were near or that the river ice might soon begin to crack. The mother marked time by the wear on their clothes, by the softening of the soap, by the length of the candle stubs in the jar. The father marked it by the feel of the tools, how stiff the leather became, how deep the frost had set into the barn door's hinges. And always, they marked time by memory. It was cold of the day we moved here, the mother might say, stirring soup, and then pause to recall the smell of pine on the wagon rails. Or the father might say, last winter the creek froze thicker, and the children would ask how thick, and he'd hold his hands apart, wider than needed, and grin. These were the stories of time, the ones not written down or numbered on a chart, but passed back and forth like the thread of a blanket, sometimes fading, sometimes fraying, but always there. And when on rare occasions someone did mention the date, perhaps in a letter tucked away in the drawer or a page torn from an old almanac, it did not hold the weight it might have in another life, in another place. January the 12th, someone might say, looking at the page, and the rest would nod politely, but no one adjusted their pace or shifted their plans. The 12th did not feel different from the 11th or the 13th. What mattered was that the snow was still deep, the woodpile still full, the fire still burning. In this way, time passed, not in minutes or hours, but it would burn in stories told, in socks patched and candles shortened. It passed in the growing length of a child's stride, in the shift of shadow on a wall, in the way one came to know, without knowing how, that spring was still far, but not unreachable. And when the day was done and the light was gone and the last ember dimmed in the stove, the family lay down once more, held not by time as the world understood it, but by rhythm, by memory, and by the deep, slow beat of winter's quiet heart. Even in the most tightly knit of frontier cabins, where love was certain and survival depended upon one another, the long winters could stretch solitude into something deeper than silence, and colder than snow. The wind outside could be relentless, but it was the quiet inside that often carried the heaviest weight, not because it was empty, but because within its folds there lived the memories of those who were far away, brothers and sisters back east, parents buried beneath gentler soil, friends who had chosen different paths, and names that had once been spoken daily, but now only surfaced in thought, stirred by the smell of wood smoke or the shape of a mountain in the distance. In winter, time did not just pass. It reached backward, pulling memories to the surface and laying them gently across the day like frost spreading across glass, slow and beautiful and unmistakably cold. The family rarely spoke of loneliness directly. It was not that they feared the word, nor that they didn't feel its ache, but simply that it lived with them so constantly during these deep winter months that it became like a shadow, always there, always quiet, and never quite needing to be named. The father, who had once traveled further than the others, carried inside him a map of places he would not see again, drawn not with ink but with memory. The bend in the road where his brother had waved goodbye, the worn porch in neighbor's house where stories were once shared over a tin mug, The scent of the sea in his youth before the land took him inland for good. These places rose up in his mind during long hours spent sharpening tools or mending leather, when no one spoke and only the ticking crackle of the fire filled the room. His hands would keep working, but his mind would walk old roads, seeing faces that time had softened and distance had blurred. The mother, quieter still in her longing, bore it in a different way. She held in the letters tucked inside the wooden box near the bed. Pages of carefully written words, folded and refolded until the creases wore thin. Letters from a sister who lived 2 counties away, from a friend who had married and gone south, from her own mother in a fading hand now still. She read them rarely, not out of neglect, but because reading them required a kind of emotional readiness, an ability to hold joy and sadness in the same breath. When she did read them, it was slowly by firelight, tracing each line with her fingertip, remembering not just the words, but the moment they were written and the life they described. Afterward, she would sit in silence, her eyes not teary but distant, as though listening for a voice only she could hear. The children, too, felt the ache, though they did not yet know to call it by name. They missed cousins they had played with once, neighbors who had shared a sled or song, the sound of familiar voice now absent. Sometimes they would speak of these people casually. "I wonder if Jonah got his puppy yet," or "Do you think Aunt Lou has snow like this?" And the parents would nod, smile gently, and let the question float in the air without an answer. There was comfort in asking, even if no answer came. It meant the names were still spoken, the threads of connection still intact. There were times, especially after supper, when the longing became heaviest. Not loud, not desperate, but a quiet weight that settled over the room when the stories ended and the fire burned low and the day had run out of distractions. It was then that someone might rise and fetch the writing tin from the shelf, the one with the good paper and the stub of blackened pencil. They would set it on the table with a kind of reverence, not because it was fancy or new. It wasn't, but because of what it represented. A bridge stretched across distance, made of ink and effort and memory. Letters were not written quickly on the frontier. They were composed slowly, with pauses of thought and with long silences between sentences, as though each word needed to be tested before it was set down to stay. The father would write with a hand more used to tools than letters, slow and firm, choosing his words like stones in a wall. The mother's handwriting was finer, curling gently around the page like thread drawn through cloth. The children might add a line or two, sometimes just a drawing, or a single sentence about the weather or the snowman they had built. These letters were not urgent. They did not report news of great consequence. They were not meant to persuade or impress. They were meant only to say, "We are here. We are thinking of you. The snow is deep, the fire is warm, and your name is still spoken in this house." Once written. The letters were folded with care, addressed in plain but legible script, and placed by the door in a pouch that would be carried the next time someone rode into town, a journey that might happen tomorrow or not for another fortnight, depending on weather and need. Until then, the letters waited, small and silent and full of meaning, like seeds pressed into winter soil, waiting for a thaw. The act of writing was enough, even without the promise of reply. It was a reminder that life extended beyond the edges of the woods, beyond the fields buried in snow, beyond the frozen creek and the forest line. It was a reminder that hearts could remain tethered across miles and seasons, that the cold could not erase what had been shared before the snow began to fall. Sometimes, instead of writing, the family would simply sit and remember together. They would speak softly of past winters in other homes, of people long gone, but still present in the curve of the story or the scent of stew on the stove. They would recall the voice of a grandfather telling tales beside a much older fire, or the laughter of a neighbor's boy who had once carved his name into the barn wall. These memories were not spoken to grieve, but to keep alive, to let the remembered live for a while within the flicker of firelight and the hush of falling snow. Loneliness, in that way, was never absolute. It visited, yes, and lingered at times, but it did not rule the house. It was held at bay by memory, by letters, by stories, and by the quiet strength of togetherness. For though the snow piled high and the world grew small, the hearts within that cabin remained wide and open, reaching across time and distance to say, in every gesture and every silence, "You are not forgotten. You are not gone. You are simply elsewhere and still with us in the ways that matter most. And so, even as the wind howled and the cold pressed close, the Frontier family endured, not just with strength and labor, but with tenderness, with remembering, and with a quiet, unwavering connection to those they loved, no matter how far away they might be. Illness, when it came to the Frontier cabin, did not announce itself with fanfare or drama, nor did it enter with sudden violence or chaos. It crept in quietly, like the cold through cracks in the floorboards or the slow drip of melting snow from the eaves, barely noticeable at first and easy to brush aside, a cough dismissed, a slight chill attributed to overwork, a flushed cheek explained away by the heat of the fire. But winter had a way of magnifying everything. What might have been mild in another season, or another place grew heavier in the presence of snow and isolation, and once sickness had taken hold, it settled deep into the bones of the house, a still and stubborn guest that would not be hurried away. It was the youngest child who fell first, though no one could say exactly when the change began. One day she had been chasing her brother around the cabin, cheeks bright and hair tangled with laughter, and the next she had grown quiet, her movements slow and unsure, her eyes glassy with something that had no name, but made the mother watch her more closely. By the time the fever came, sharp and undeniable, the family had already begun to act with the soft urgency that arises when fear arrives, but must be contained for the sake of those still well. The girl was wrapped in blankets and placed nearest the fire, and the room was rearranged without words to accommodate this new, fragile center around which all else would now turn. The mother moved like a shadow across the room, her hands always at work. Cooling cloths soaked in water drawn from the snowmelt pot, ladling broth into a tin cup, stroking the child's forehead with fingers that trembled only when no one was looking. The father stood quieter than usual, his presence heavy and still, fetching what was needed without being asked, chopping wood with more force than necessary, and returning often to stand by the door, listening for nothing in particular, but unwilling to be far. The older children grew solemn, their play forgotten, their questions whispered and brief. Even the dog seemed subdued, pacing near the hearth, lying close to the girl, lifting his head at every sigh or cough. In such moments, time changed again. The slow rhythm of winter, already blurred and gentle, became even softer, stretched out by worry and wakefulness. The nights grew longer not because of the dark outside, but because no one slept deeply. They rested in turns, eyes half open, ears tuned to the small sounds that might signal change, a new sharpness in a cough, a shiver that passed too quickly, a whisper that sounded like pain. The fire was kept burning constantly, and the stove was never left unattended, for the girl needed warmth as much as she needed rest. They had no doctor, there were none nearby, and even if there had been, the snow made travel nearly impossible. What they had was memory, remedies passed down from parent and grandparents, stories told in kitchens and cabins long ago. The mother steeped willow bark for its bitter broth, rubbed the child's chest with bear grease mixed with pine resin, whispered prayers half remembered from her childhood while she pressed cool cloths against a burning brow. She sang, too, softly, lullabies from another place, her voice barely above a breath, as if the melody itself might coax the fever to loosen its grip. The father spoke less, but his silence was not absence. He kept the room in order, the animals fed, the water buckets full, the firewood stacked high. He sat by the bed in the early hours when the others slept, staring into the flames, his hands folded tightly together in a way that betrayed the fear he never voiced. He did not ask whether she would recover. He did not speak of what might come if she did not. He simply stayed, through every hour, every gasp, every restless toss beneath the quilts, and in that stay was all the love he could give. Outside, the snow fell endlessly, the world wrapped in white and hush, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The light through the windows grew dimmer, not because the sun was fading, but because worry colored everything with a pale gray. Meals were eaten in silence. Work was done more slowly. The letters by the door remained unwritten, untouched, for there were no words worth sending just then. The house became its own world, and its world revolved around the rise and fall of a child's fevered breath. But then, slowly, so slowly that at first no one dared to believe it, the fever broke. It did not vanish in an instant, did not lift like a storm retreating into the hills. It receded, hour by hour, leaving behind a quiet weakness, a hollow look, a stillness that came not from sleep, but from deep exhaustion. The girl stirred one morning and asked for water, not much, not loud, but clear, and the mother, who had not wept during the worst of it, had to turn her face away then, pressing a hand to her mouth to stifle a sound that rose unbidden from her throat. Recovery was just as slow as the illness had been fast. The girl remained wrapped in blankets, propped gently near the fire, her voice hoarse and her movements few. She ate only broth at first, then small pieces of bread soaked in warm milk, her appetite returning like the light at the end of a long dusk. The family moved gently around her, their steps softer, their voices warmer, their laughter more careful but no less real. They did not speak of how close they had come to the edge, but they carried it with them, each in their own way, grateful and quiet and slightly changed. Even after she was well enough to play again, to eat heartily and sleep without fever dreams, a certain gentleness lingered in the cabin. The others watched her more closely. The father reached to touch her hair more often. The mother sometimes paused in her work, just to watch the child's chest rise and fall with steady breath. It was not fear anymore, but reverence, an awareness of how fragile life could be, how suddenly it could shift, and how fiercely it must be protected, even in the silence of a snowbound winter. Outside, the snow still lay thick across the land. The cold still pressed against the door. But inside the cabin, there was warmth, not just from the fire, but from survival, from the small, unspoken miracle of a child's heartbeat returning to its calm rhythm. And in that warmth, the family rested, not without scars, not without memory, but with a deeper sense of what it meant to be together in the stillness of a world that offered no guarantees, only moments. There were nights during the long frontier winters when the cold outside seemed absolute, when the fire in the stove, though steady and hot, could not quite drive back the feeling that the snow had crept into the very grain of the wood and settled into the bones of the house. On such nights, the silence hung thicker than usual, not the peaceful quiet of snowfall or the hush of sleeping children, but a kind of muffled stillness that pressed against the walls and ceilings, as though the whole world had exhaled and forgotten how to breathe again. Words came slowly, if at all. Movements were minimal. The flicker of flame against the wall became the only rhythm in the room. But even in the heaviest parts of the season, when the snow had not melted for weeks and the sun had made itself scarce for days at a time, there were moments when something lighter stirred among them. And often, that something was music, not loud or showy or structured in any grand way, but small, simple, almost secret in the way it arrived, as if it were something the family remembered rather than created, something passed down through silence rather than taught aloud. It came not to perform or distract, but to comfort, to warm in ways the fire could not. The father, quiet and steady in all things, kept an old harmonica, wrapped in cloth, and tucked into the drawer beside the hearth. It was not much to look at, its wooden frame worn smooth with age, the metal dulled and slightly dented, but it held within a sound that could change the air of the room in an instant. He did not play often, and never on request. It had to come from something deeper, a feeling, a need, and when that need rose up, sometimes late at night when the others were still or drifting towards sleep, he would reach for it silently, unwrap it without ceremony, and lift it to his lips. The first notes were always uncertain, like footsteps on a cold floor, testing their place. Then, slowly, the melody would form, thin at first, then fuller, a line of sound rising and falling like breath. It was not music from books or written pages. It was music remembered from boyhood, from old songs sung around other fires and other winters, from voices now long gone, but still echoing the patterns of notes he carried in his chest. The tunes were simple, folk songs, lullabies, waltzes, hymns, but they were full of weight, full of meaning not tied to lyrics but to memory. The children would stop their whispering. The mother would still her hands, letting the mending fall to her lap. Even the dog would lift its head, ears twitching, eyes half lidded with recognition. The sound was not loud, not even bold, but it filled the space between them in a way nothing else could, weaving through the shadows and between the cracks in the floor, rising to the beams above, and settling over the room like a soft blanket. It was not joy exactly, but something near it, something quieter, more lasting. A reminder of the world beyond the snow. When the harmonica's notes faded into silence, no one rushed to fill the space with words. The silence afterward was as full as the music itself, warm, reverent, healing. The father would wrap the instrument once more and return it to its drawer, nodding slightly to no one in particular, and the others would return to whatever they had been doing, but slower now, softer. The fire would crackle a little more gently. The children would lie closer together, and the mother, with her eyes lowered but her lips curled in the faintest smile, might begin to hum a tune of her own. Her songs were older still, melodies her mother had hummed while kneading bread or brushing out her hair. Fragments of half-remembered ballads passed down from women who had crossed oceans and fields and rivers long before this cabin was ever built. She did not sing with words. She did not sing loudly. Her music was a murmur, more breath than sound, and yet it reached every corner of the cabin, as if carried by some current of memory too soft to see, but too strong to stop. She would hum while cooking, while rocking a child, while gazing into flames, and the tune would drift and whine and change, never quite the same, but always familiar. It was music for staying, music for waiting, music for surviving. The children, too, made music in their way, not with instruments or skill, but with clapping hands and tapping feet, with rhymes recited under quilts and rhythms beaten on the wooden walls with fingertips. On the rare afternoons when the sun peeked in for more than a moment, they might dance in the patches of light that stretched across the floor, spinning in their boots, arms out, laughter rising like birds startled from branches. Their voices would rise in little chants remembered from games back east or invented from the woods outside. One for crow and two for the tree. They'd sing, or snow on the window, snow on the roof, snow in my mittens, and snow in my soup. The parents didn't always laugh, but they listened, and in their stillness was something like gratitude, for the sound, for the joy, for the noise of children alive and well. And sometimes on the longest nights when the wind blew fiercest and the darkness seemed to crowd in close around the windows, the family would sing together. Not every night, and never for long, but just enough to remind themselves that the sound of many voices can soften even the hardest cold. Their songs were uneven, their harmonies rough and fleeting, but they sang them anyway. Shenandoah, perhaps, or Bright Morning Stars, or some hymn whose verses they only half knew. They would close their eyes and let the melody carry them past the snowdrifts and the bare trees and the creaking beams, out beyond the clearing, and into a world that, for a few moments, did not feel quite so narrow. Music, in that winter, was not an event. It was not entertainment. It was presence. It was connection. It was the sound of something human rising up inside the cold and the stillness, and saying, I am here. We are here. The snow may cover the road and silence the woods and press against the windows, but it cannot take this from us. Not this sound. Not this breath. And so the winter continued, and the music remained, never loud, never constant, but always near, always possible. It lived in the drawer beside the stove, in the hum beneath a mother's breath, in the soft tap of a child's boot against the wall, in the unspoken rhythms of a family that knew how to wait, and how to remember, and how to fill even the coldest room with warmth the fire alone could never provide. Though the days were short and the nights long, though the snow muffled the landscape and the cold pressed in from all sides, the family found, still, small sparks of brightness within their narrow world, moments so quiet and modest they might have gone unnoticed to anyone but those who lived inside them. These were not grand joys, not the kind sung about in ballads or written down in family records, but they were joys nonetheless. Quiet pleasures woven into routine of winter like bright threads in a pale quilt. A child's laugh, a smooth pebble kept in a pocket, the shape of frost feathers on the window pane. These became treasures, not because of what they were, but because of how they made the heart remember that beauty was still possible, even when the world was buried in silence and snow. The youngest child, once recovered from her illness, had taken to drawing pictures on the inside wall near her sleeping corner, using the soft charcoal left over from the stove's cleaning. At first, it had been simple marks, lines and circles that faded as quickly as they appeared, smudged by a passing elbow or the brushing of blankets. But over time, the drawings became more deliberate, more thoughtful. A tree, slightly crooked but unmistakable. A bird with round wings. A figure with bonnet and a smile. No one told her to stop. No one scolded her for marking the wood. In fact, the mother had once gone so far as to smooth a fresh board with sandpaper, giving the child a cleaner surface for her next masterpiece. Each morning, before the work began and the rhythm of chores resumed, the family would glance at the newest addition. They didn't speak much about it, but the smiles that passed between them were genuine and unguarded. The drawings, dark against the lighter wood, became a kind of calendar, each one marking another day survived, another spark of joy carved out of the winter's monotony. They were not permanent, and perhaps by spring they would be scrubbed away. But for now, they were part of the room, part of the day, part of the memory of what it meant to endure and still create. The boy, older and more quiet, had taken to carving with his small knife, a blade dull by use and care, but still capable of shaping it into recognizable forms. He used the leftover scraps from his father's repairs. Pieces of broken handles, splinters from the woodpile, branches trimmed from the apple tree last fall. He worked slowly, not aiming for perfection but for presence, shaping small animals with blocky legs and round heads, giving them names known only to himself, lining them up beneath the edge of the bunk like a silent herd ready for their day's imagined journey. He did not speak of them often, and he did not expect praise, but when the baby laughed at a wooden cow or the dog sniffed curiously a carved fox, a small light flickered behind his eyes, a satisfaction deeper than words. There were other rituals, too, things the family did not because they had to, but because they had always done them, and because in doing them, they reminded themselves of who they were beyond survival. One such ritual was the saving of a treat, a piece of sweetness tucked away and guarded through weeks of restraint. A jar of wild strawberry jam, preserved from the brief sweetness of summer, sat on the top shelf, wrapped in cloth to keep out the light. It was not touched during ordinary days. It was not meant for hunger, but for celebration. And so it remained there unopened, a promise to be fulfilled not when food ran low, but when spirits ran low, when the cold had gone on too long, when tempers frayed, when silence hung too thickly in the corners. When that day came, as it always did, the mother would reach for the jar without fanfare, her hand moving toward it with a grace that made the children straighten in their seats and glance at one another with rising anticipation. The lid would be loosened, the scent of strawberries rising like a whisper of sunlight, and the jam would be spooned in careful portions onto coarse bread, turning the brown slice into something close to celebration. There was no ceremony, no singing, no toast, but in the quiet chewing, in the sighs of contentment, in the shared glances across the table, something in the cabin warmed beyond what the fire could offer. It was joy, not loud, not lasting, but deeply felt. They also kept a ritual for marking the new moon, a habit brought from older generations who had once followed the cycles of the sky with more attention than most gave now. On the night when the moon was smallest, when even its silver curve could not be seen through the frost-laced windows, the family would dim the lanterns and sit together in near darkness, wrapped in quilts, speaking only if moved to do so. They called it moon-sitting, not a religious observance, not a superstition, but a way of noticing something outside themselves, of remembering that the world was turning even when it could not be seen. The children would lie back against their parents and listen for the wind in the chimney, for the creak of the beams, for the soft hush of breath. The quiet was not empty. It was filled with presence. On Sundays, though every day felt much the same in the depths of winter, they made a point to rest, even if the resting looked like less work rather than no work at all. The tools were put away. The mending paused. The barn swept instead of shoveled. The meals were slightly richer, the chores less urgent. The mother might read aloud from the Bible, her voice slow and soft, not with fire and fear, but with calm reassurance. The children would listen, or drift in and out of sleep, as the words wound through the room like a lullaby. Afterward, they might speak of old stories, of their parents' childhoods, of winters before this one, of what life had been like before the prairie, before the clearing, before the cabin. These conversations were not planned. They unfolded like branches, reaching in unexpected directions, and through them, the family remembered they were not the first to face the snow, nor would they be the last. Even the dog had his ritual, a slow circuit of the cabin each evening, nose pressed to each door and corner, ears alert, tail flicking with satisfaction. He would return to the hearth, settle onto the rug, and let out a sigh that seemed to release the whole day's tension at once. The children found comfort in that sigh. It meant things were right. It meant the house was whole. So the days passed, not in grand events, but in the repetition of things small and beloved. And in those repetitions, the family found steadiness, and in steadiness, peace. They stitched a new patch onto the quilt, not because it was torn, but because they had saved a piece of cloth too beautiful not to use. They turned the lantern lower not to save oil, but to watch the shadows move more gently on the wall. They watched the snow fall not with dread, but with quiet appreciation for its softness, for its silence, for the way it made even the hardest world look clean and still. And as winter pressed on, as the weeks blurred and the snowdrifts deepened, these small joys, the picture on the wall, the carved animal, the spoonful of jam, became more than moments. They became markers. They became meaning. They were the answer to the question of why a family continued to endure. Not because they must, but because within the coldest season, they still found things worth keeping warm. It did not come suddenly, the change. There was no single morning when the snow melted, no thunderous crack of ice splitting from riverbanks, no chorus of birds bursting from the trees to herald the arrival of warmth. Instead, it came like everything else had come that winter. Quietly, slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the world itself had grown uncertain of how to be anything other than frozen. Yet the change had come, not with spectacle, but with a soft unfolding, and the family, who had waited so long and with such patience, did not miss the signs. The first was the sound of dripping. It began one morning as a faint, intermittent tapping above the cabin's porch roof, a solitary note, almost too soft to notice at first. The father, stepping outside to fetch more firewood, paused with his hand on the doorframe, his ears tuned not to the wind or the silence, but to that delicate rhythm. He stood for a moment, looking up at the edge of the roof where a single icicle had grown long and sharp through the weeks of bitter cold. A droplet formed on its tip, caught the light like glass, and fell. One drop, then another, and then another. The sound was not much, not compared to the silence of the last months, but it was enough to stir something in the chest, something soft and long dormant. He called to the children without raising his voice, and they came running, coats half-buttoned and eyes wide with curiosity, and he pointed not at the trees, not at the sky, but at that simple bead of water. "Listen," he said, "just listen." The roof continued to drip all day. The next sign came in the air itself, not its warmth, for it was still cold, nor its smell, for the scent of earth remained hidden beneath snow, but in its softness. The sharp edge of winter's breath dulled slightly, no longer cutting across the face with quite the same ferocity. The wind, once relentless and raw, moved with less force, as though it too had grown tired and was ready to rest. On the second morning of the dripping, the mother opened the window just a crack, while cooking, letting in a stream of outside air, and when it drifted across the room, carried with it nothing more than cold, clean stillness. She closed her eyes for a moment and simply breathed. The snow had not melted, not in any significant way, but it had begun to change. No longer dry and powdery beneath the boot, it had grown heavy and damp, and when the children walked upon it, it packed beneath their feet instead of scattering in bursts of dust. Snowballs held together longer. Footprints lingered deeper. A crust formed on the surface in the early morning and melted into slush by mid-afternoon. These were small things, but on the frontier, where observation had become a kind of survival, they did not go unnoticed. The family spoke of them gently, almost reverently, as though naming them too loudly might scare them away. And then came the bird. It was the oldest child who saw it first, a dark speck perched on the bare branch of the twisted apple tree behind the barn. He had been splitting wood, his breath visible in the cold, his hands aching with the repetition of labor, when he stopped suddenly and stared at the motionless shape. At first, he thought it a trick of the light or a knot in the branch, but then the bird moved, ruffling its feathers, letting out a small, tentative chirp that barely reached his ears. It was not a colorful bird, not a songbird, not even one he could name, but it was not one of the winter creatures. It had not been there before. It had returned. He ran inside to tell the others, his boots clumping heavily on the wooden floor, his words tumbling out too fast, too loud. The father raised an eyebrow and stepped outside, and when he returned a few minutes later, he nodded once, slowly. "He's right," he said, and that was enough to make the children dance in place. their joy no longer suppressed by caution. Even the mother, who had grown careful about hope, allowed herself a smile that reached her eyes. The bird stayed for the rest of the day and flew away that evening, but its brief visit had already done its work. It had reminded them that the world was moving again. Inside the cabin, the change came subtly, not just in the temperature, but in the way the family moved and breathed. They no longer huddled quite so close to the stove. The layers of clothing, though still thick, began to loosen slightly. The mother began to open the shutters a little earlier in the morning and let in more of the pale daylight. The father, who had spent months working quietly and methodically, began to make plans aloud again about the fence he would mend, the seeds they would sort, the tools he would sharpen once the barn floor thawed. The children spent longer outside, stomping paths through the softening snow, their mittens soaked and their faces flushed with color. They spoke of spring in cautious tones, remembering last year when the thaw had come too early and been swallowed by a second freeze. But even so, they dug out their wooden sleds and let them glide down the crusty hills, and the laughter that rose in their throats no longer seemed borrowed from another time. It was theirs again, real and rooted in the present. And then, after days of drip and softening and silence, came the sound of water. At first, it was just a trickle beneath the snow near the woods, where the small creek had lain frozen for months. The father noticed it while checking the fence line. He crouched beside the white bank and pressed his hand to the ground. It was faint, like a whisper beneath layers of cotton, but it was unmistakable. Running water. The ice was loosening. The world beneath the snow was waking. He called the children and led them back the next morning. Together, they stood by the edge of the creek and listened. It wasn't much yet, no rush, no cascade, but it was enough. The boy dropped a pebble into a small hole in the ice and watched it vanish with a quiet plunk. They didn't say much, but in that silence was something vibrant, something alive. Back at the cabin, the mother opened the windows wide that afternoon, just for a moment, and let the air move freely through the rooms. It was cold, but it no longer carried the same heaviness. It smelled of melting, of damp wood and wet soil. Not yet spring, but the suggestion of it, like a word whispered through a crack in a door. She wiped the sills with a rag and began to sweep the corners of the cabin. Even though dust was still thin, it was not cleaning for necessity. It was cleaning for readiness. That evening, when the candle was lit and supper had been eaten, the father took out the harmonica without being asked. He played a tune not of sorrow or endurance, but something with a lilt, something that swayed gently like branches in a thawing breeze. The children tapped their feet. The mother hummed. The dog wagged his tail. It wasn't celebration. Not yet, but it was something close. And outside, beneath the blanket of snow that still covered the land, roots were beginning to stir deep in the soil. The days were still short. The nights were still cold. But the world had shifted. The wait was nearly over. When the thaw finally arrived in earnest, it did not come with grandeur or sudden splendor. It unfolded in layers and textures, in moments so subtle that they might have gone unnoticed, if not for the many weeks of stillness that had come before. The snow melted not with haste, but with grace, sinking slowly into the warming soil, revealing brown grass flattened by months of wait, twigs that had fallen unnoticed in a storm, footprints fossilized and then blurred, and the soft beginnings of green shoots pushing their way toward the sun with no ceremony, only purpose. The cold retreated not as a defeated enemy, but as a weary visitor quietly gathering its things and slipping out the back door. Inside the cabin, the fire was still lit each morning, but less for necessity than for comfort. The chill no longer claimed the corners of the room as it once had, and the family had begun gently to shed the layers they had worn for so long. Coats hung with more space between them, mittens placed in drawers, scarves folded and stored in wooden boxes with sachets of dried herbs. The thick quilts were still used, but now they lay in lighter folds across the beds, and at night, the air no longer bit at the edges of their dreams. The house had changed, not in structure but in spirit. It felt less like a shelter and more like a home again. The children returned to the yard with a kind of uncontained wonder, as if seeing it for the first time. The land that had been white and still and featureless for so long now offered new secrets. Patches of bare earth, still damp and dark, squelched beneath their boots. Tiny flowers, no more than green stubs with a hint of color, poked up from between roots. Birds returned in twos and threes, their songs tentative but growing bolder with each new day. And the creek, which had murmured beneath the snow, now ran freely, a ribbon of silver through the thawed woods, carrying leaves and twigs and the first reflections of spring skies. The father, who had labored through the cold with unflinching steadiness, now moved with something lighter in his step, though he still said little. His eyes scanned the treetops for buds, his boots trampled new paths along the fence line, and his hands, callous and cracked, turned again to the tasks of building and planting and repairing. But the weight of urgency had lessened. He worked now with hope as much as necessity, humming beneath his breath as he checked the roof for winter damage. His face lifted more often toward the sky. He was not a man prone to many words, but in the angle of his shoulders and the cadence of his stride, one could read the quiet language of relief. The mother, too, began to shift, though her transformations were smaller, more interior. She stood longer in the open doorways, letting the wind move through her hair. She sat on the porch steps with a basket of mending, not because there was nowhere else to work, but because she wanted to feel the sun, still pale but present, on her cheeks. Her movements were slower, more thoughtful, not from weariness, but from an almost reverent savoring of each moment, not filled with fear or cold. She gathered dried herbs with care, planned her spring garden with quiet excitement, and sang more often, not in lullabies or laments, but in old folk songs that had no clear meaning except that they made her heart feel less heavy. And in the evening, when the day's labor was done and the sky turned lavender above the tree line, the family would sit together outside. Not for long, just a few minutes at first, while the warmth held. They would sit on logs or on the porch or simply in the grass, and they would listen, not just to each other, but to the world as it stirred back to life. They listened to frogs calling from the low places near the woods. They listened to the creaking of trees waking from their frozen sleep. They listened to the wind no longer howling but whispering, as if tired from all its shouting. And in those shared silences, a kind of communion formed. Not loud, not formal, but deeply understood. No one spoke much of the winter, once it had passed. They did not retell the hardest nights, or dwell on the moments when illness or hunger or fear had brushed too close. Those things live within them now, not as open wounds, but as quiet truths folded into the layers of who they had become. The hardship was not forgotten, but neither was it named too often. Instead, it showed itself in a way they touched each other's shoulders when passing, in the extra slice of bread offered without asking, in the way they looked at the baby when she laughed, or at each other when the sun rose behind the ridge. The winter had changed them, but not in the ways they had feared. It had not broken them. It had deepened them. There were new plans to be made, seeds to be planted, tools to be cleaned, roofs to be patched. And though these things were no different than they had been a year before, they now carried a weight of meaning that went beyond the chore itself. Each task was a statement. We are still here. We have come through. The cold may come again, but for now, we walk in the thaw. The land is not dead. The hands are not empty. The heart is not alone. The final piles of snow melted in the shadows of the cabin, lingering just long enough to be noticed. The icicles vanished from the eaves. The birds built their nests in the corners of the barn. The children scattered their toys in the grass. And one morning, just as the sun crested the low hill beyond the trees, the youngest child stood barefoot in the dew-soaked yard and reached out her arms toward the warmth. She did not speak. She simply stood, and in her small, still body there was a message as clear as any word. The season had changed. And so they entered spring, not triumphantly, not with shouts or banners, but with quiet steps and steady hands. They did not forget what they had endured, but they no longer had to live within it. The winter had not taken them. It had shaped them. And now, as the earth softened and the days lengthened and the world returned to color and sound, they were ready, not just to survive, but to grow. And in their hearts, a deep, still warmth began to bloom, fragile, hopeful, and as steady as the drip of thawing snow.